What if everything you thought you knew about the pyramids was wrong? Imagine standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza at midnight, alone, surrounded by 2.3 million stone blocks that have kept their secrets for over 4 millennia. The air is thick with mystery, and you can feel something humming beneath your feet. A vibration so subtle it might just be your imagination. Or might it be something far more extraordinary? Tonight join Dr. Marcus Chen, a field researcher whose life's work straddles the boundary between archaeology and physics, as he uncovers evidence that will shake the very foundations of what we believe about ancient Egypt. This isn't just another story about pharaohs and burial chambers. This is about technology so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that modern science is only beginning to understand its true purpose. Are you ready to discover that the Great Pyramid wasn't built to house the dead, but to power the living? The desert wind carried more than sand that October evening. It carried the weight of 4,000 years of secrets, swirling around the massive limestone blocks that rose from the Giza plateau like ancient guardians against the darkening sky. Dr. Marcus Chen pulled his field jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the Great Pyramid, his archaeological permit clutched in one hand and a case of sensitive instruments in the other. For 15 years, Marcus had studied these monuments from afar, poring over blueprints in university libraries, analysing satellite imagery, and debating theories with colleagues over late-night coffee. He'd written papers on the pyramid's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, and its construction techniques. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The entrance shaft yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial beast. His Egyptian guide, Hassan, gestured him forward with a weathered hand that had led countless tourists through these passages. But tonight was different. Tonight Marcus had special permission to remain inside after closing, to conduct his research in the profound silence that only comes when the tourist crowds fade away. "Dr. Chen," Hassan said, his English tinged with the accent of the Nile Delta. "You're sure you want to stay alone? The pyramid. She speaks differently at night." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Hassan meant. "I need to take measurements without interference. The electromagnetic readings are too important to risk contamination from cameras and cell phones." As they ducked through the entrance and began their descent into the ancient passageway, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected, a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots. It was barely perceptible, like standing near a power plant or a subway station, but unmistakably present. The limestone blocks seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if the entire structure were somehow alive. "Hassan," he said, pausing to place his palm against the cool stone wall, "do you feel that?" The guide's eyes met his in the dim LED lighting they'd strung along the passage. "You feel it too?" Most visitors, they notice nothing, but some, the ones who know how to listen, they feel the heart of the pyramid beating. Marcus's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations: seismic activity from Cairo traffic, thermal expansion and contraction of the limestone, perhaps underground water movement. But as they climbed deeper into the structure, following the grand gallery toward the king's chamber, the sensation only grew stronger. The textbooks had described every measurement, every angle, every architectural feature, but they had failed to capture this, the sense that he was walking through the corridors of a machine rather than a tomb. The walls weren't just precisely cut, they were purposeful, functional, as if each block had been positioned not just to support weight, but to channel something else entirely. By the time Hassan left him alone in the king's chamber with his instruments, and a promise to return at dawn, Marcus was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about the Great Pyramid was about to change. The silence in the king's chamber was absolute. Not the gentle quiet of a library or the muffled stillness of a snow-covered landscape, but the profound absence of sound that only exists deep within solid rock far from the surface world. Marcus set his equipment case on the granite floor and began unpacking his instruments, but his eyes kept returning to the walls around him. For a structure supposedly built as the eternal resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, the king's chamber was remarkably empty. No hieroglyphs adorned the walls, no colourful depictions of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, no ornate decorations celebrating his divine status. just smooth, precisely fitted granite blocks that formed a perfect rectangular space. Marcus had visited dozens of legitimate Egyptian tombs, from the elaborate burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings to smaller mastabas scattered throughout the desert. Every single one had been filled with artwork, inscriptions and symbolic elements designed to guide and protect the deceased in the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessive about decorating their tombs. It was perhaps their most distinctive cultural trait. So why was the most important tomb in Egypt completely bare? He pulled out his digital calipers and began measuring the chamber's dimensions, cross-referencing them with his notes. 10.47 metres long, 5.24 metres wide, 5.84 metres high. But as he worked, something else caught his attention: the acoustics. "Hello?" he called out softly, and the word came back to him transformed. Not a simple echo, but something more complex, a resonance that seemed to build upon itself, creating harmonics that his voice alone couldn't produce. He clapped his hands sharply and the sound reverberated through the chamber in waves, each echo slightly different from the last. Marcus had studied acoustical engineering as part of his physics background, and he knew what he was hearing. The chamber was tuned. The proportions, the materials, even the placement in the pyramid weren't arbitrary. They had been calculated to create specific resonant frequencies. He set up his sound meter and began a systematic test, clapping at different spots around the chamber and recording the acoustic response. The data was remarkable. The chamber was resonating at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness in humans. Ancient peoples around the world had built structures with similar acoustic properties. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hippogæum in Malta, certain chambers at Stonehenge. But there was something more. As Marcus moved his sound meter around the room, he noticed that the acoustic properties weren't uniform. The northeast corner produced different harmonics than the southwest. The centre of the chamber created the strongest resonance, while areas near the walls seemed to dampen certain frequencies while amplifying others. It was as if the entire chamber had been designed as a three-dimensional instrument, capable of producing complex acoustic patterns that modern sound engineers would struggle to replicate. This wasn't the work of ancient stonemasons building a burial vault. This was the product of sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and acoustic engineering. Marcus sat cross-legged in the centre of the chamber and closed his eyes, letting the subtle vibrations he'd felt earlier wash over him. The sensation was stronger here, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It reminded him of standing next to a massive pipe organ, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest cavity. But there were no pipes here, no mechanical system that could produce such vibrations, unless... He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, with its 9 massive granite beams supporting thousands of tons of limestone above. Each beam weighed between 25 and 80 tons, and had been quarried from Aswan 500 miles to the south. The precision with which they'd been placed was extraordinary. The gaps between them were uniform to within millimetres. What if those gaps weren't just structural? What if they were intentional spacing, designed to create specific resonant frequencies when subjected to external forces? The entire chamber could be functioning as a resonating cavity, with the granite beams acting as tuning elements. Marcus pulled out his electromagnetic field detector and switched it on. Immediately the device began registering low-level EM activity. Not strong, but definitely present and distinctly non-random. The readings were strongest near the walls and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations he could feel through the floor. No pharaoh had ever been found in this chamber. No evidence of burial had ever been discovered. No grave goods, no mummy. No indication that this space had ever served its supposed purpose as a tomb. But it was definitely serving some purpose. The question was, what? The next morning, Hassan returned to find Marcus still awake, surrounded by printouts from his instruments and covered in limestone dust. The researcher had spent the night exploring every accessible passage in the pyramid, and his findings were beginning to form a picture that contradicted everything in the archaeological textbooks. "Dr. Chen, you look like you have seen the jinn," Hassan said, offering him a thermos of strong coffee. "What did the pyramid tell you?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured toward his scattered notes. "Hassan, I need to see the subterranean chamber, the one most tourists never visit." Hassan's expression grew serious. "That chamber, she is dangerous. Very old, very deep. The air is not good there." "I have proper equipment," Marcus insisted, "and I think what's down there might be the key to understanding what this place really is." An hour later, they were descending through a narrow shaft that led to the lowest accessible level of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber lay more than 30 metres beneath the base of the structure, carved directly from the bedrock. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with moisture. The passage opened into a rough-hewn chamber unlike anything else in the pyramid. Where the king's chamber was precisely cut granite, this space looked unfinished, almost crude. But Marcus wasn't interested in the chamber itself, he was focused on the walls. "Hassan, bring the light closer." The LED beam revealed what Marcus had hoped to find: unmistakable signs of water erosion. The limestone walls bore the smooth, flowing patterns that only come from sustained contact with moving water. Not the random pitting of desert sandstorms or the crystalline deposits of occasional flooding, but the systematic erosion of deliberate water flow. Marcus ran his fingers along the channels carved into the rock. This wasn't occasional flooding. Water flowed through here regularly, probably for centuries. Hassan nodded. "My grandfather, he told stories. Before the dam, before the modern irrigation, the Nile would flood every year. Sometimes the water would find ways underground, through cracks and caves. Maybe it came here." But Marcus was thinking about more than just flood patterns. He pulled out a geological map of the area and spread it on his portable table. The Giza Plateau sat on a limestone shelf that extended deep underground, honeycombed with natural caves and passages. The Nile, just a few kilometres away, had carved its path through this same limestone over millions of years. "Hassan, what if the annual flooding wasn't accidental? What if this chamber was designed to flood?" He pointed to the roughly carved passages that branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness. These could be intake channels. When the Nile floods, water would flow through underground passages and fill this chamber, then rise up through the pyramid's internal structure. Marcus began sketching a diagram, his excitement growing. "Look at this. Water enters here, rises through the Grand Gallery, which is angled like a spillway, and reaches the king's chamber. But that chamber isn't at the top of the pyramid. There are shafts leading up from it." Hassan studied the drawing. "You think the pyramid was some kind of water machine? Not just water. Think about what happens when you force pressurized water through granite." Hassan looked puzzled, so Marcus elaborated. "Granite contains quartz crystals. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, like water flowing under pressure, it generates electricity. It's called the piezoelectric effect. We use it in modern electronics." The implications were staggering. If Marcus was right, the Great Pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. It was a hydroelectric generator, using the annual Nile floods to create pressurized water flow through chambers lined with granite. The precise positioning of the granite blocks, the careful engineering of the internal passages, the acoustic tuning of the chambers, all of it could be explained as components of a massive power generation system. Marcus spent the next several hours taking measurements of the subterranean chamber, documenting the erosion patterns and mapping the passages. Every piece of evidence supported his growing hypothesis. The pyramid builders hadn't just been skilled stonemasons, they had been hydraulic engineers, working with an understanding of electricity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ancient Egyptians possessed this level of technological sophistication, what else had they known that modern archaeology had missed? And why had this knowledge been lost? As they climbed back toward the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The desert wind that greeted them at the pyramid's entrance seemed to carry whispers of forgotten science, lost wisdom, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The next day found Marcus standing on the Giza Plateau at dawn, his GPS equipment spread out on a folding table, as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Hassan had brought along his cousin Karim, a modern engineer who worked for the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism, and had access to more sophisticated surveying equipment than Marcus could carry. "Dr. Chen, you said you wanted to verify the pyramid's alignment," Karim asked, adjusting the precision GPS receiver. "I must tell you, this has been measured many times. The accuracy is well documented." Marcus nodded, checking his own instruments. "I'm not questioning the accuracy. I'm trying to understand why that accuracy was necessary." The numbers were indeed remarkable. As the GPS data streamed in and the surveying laser painted its invisible lines across the desert, the measurements confirmed what archaeologists had known for decades. The Great Pyramid was aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. In modern terms, that was more precise than the magnetic compasses available to 19th century explorers. But Marcus was looking at more than just cardinal directions. He had brought along a magnetometer, an instrument that could detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. As he moved the device around the pyramid's base, the readings told a fascinating story. "Karim, look at this." Marcus showed him the magnetometer display. "The pyramid isn't just aligned to true north. It's positioned at a point where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual characteristics. The Giza Plateau sat at a convergence point of several magnetic anomalies. Underground iron ore deposits created localized field variations, while the limestone bedrock contained enough ferrous minerals to influence compass readings. But more significantly, the pyramid's position corresponded to a point where the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents were particularly strong. Marcus had studied similar phenomena at other ancient sites. Stonehenge sat on a complex intersection of underground streams and geological fault lines that created measurable electromagnetic effects. Newgrange in Ireland was positioned where 2 underground rivers converged, creating conditions that produced natural electrical fields. Machu Picchu was built on a granite peak that generated piezoelectric charges during seismic activity. The pattern was consistent. Ancient builders had chosen locations where the Earth's natural electromagnetic properties were enhanced. They hadn't just been looking for stable ground or religious significance. They had been searching for specific energetic conditions. "Hassan," Marcus called to his guide, who was photographing the sunrise from the pyramid's eastern face, "your grandfather's stories. Did any of them mention lights?" Hassan walked over, his expression thoughtful. "Lights? You mean like the tourist illumination?" "No, I mean lights that might have been seen historically, strange lights, unexplained phenomena." Hassan's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, yes. The old people, they would speak of the lights that danced around the pyramid during certain seasons, usually during the flood time, when the Nile was high. They called them the souls of the pharaohs, but my grandfather, he was educated man. He thought maybe they were something else." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something else? He worked for British archaeologists in the 1920s. They had instruments, cameras. One night during flood season, they saw lights moving around the pyramid's apex. Blue-white lights, like electricity. The photographs they took showed, what do you call them? Discharge patterns. Electromagnetic discharge. Marcus had seen similar phenomena at other ancient sites during periods of high atmospheric electricity. If the pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field, then during certain conditions, perhaps when underground water levels were high and atmospheric electrical activity was increased, it might actually generate visible electrical discharges. Marcus spent the morning taking detailed measurements of the electromagnetic conditions around the pyramid. The data revealed a complex pattern of electrical activity that varied with the time of day, the season, and the underground water levels. The pyramid wasn't just passively sitting in an electromagnetically active location. It appeared to be designed to harness and focus that activity. The internal structure suddenly made more sense. The king's chamber, with its precise granite construction, would act as a focal point for electromagnetic energy generated by the pressure of water on quartz crystals. The shaft systems leading from the chamber would serve as waveguides, directing the electrical energy toward the pyramid's apex. The entire structure was essentially a massive electromagnetic antenna, designed to capture, generate and transmit electrical energy using natural forces. But transmit it where? And for what purpose? As Marcus packed his equipment, he realized he was no longer looking at an ancient tomb or even an advanced power plant. He was looking at a piece of technology so sophisticated that modern science was only beginning to understand its principles. The builders of the Great Pyramid hadn't just mastered hydraulic engineering and electromagnetic theory. They had created a machine that interfaced directly with the planet's own energy systems. The question that haunted him as they walked back to the nearby village was this: if such advanced technology had existed over 4,000 years ago, what had happened to the civilization that created it? Dr. Amara Soliman met Marcus at a coffee shop in central Cairo, away from the tourist crowds and government oversight that surrounded the Giza Plateau. As one of Egypt's leading thermal imaging specialists, she'd been involved in some of the most significant recent discoveries at the pyramids, including the 2015 detection of mysterious voids within the Great Pyramid structure. "Dr. Chen," she said, sliding a tablet across the small table between them, "what you're asking to see, these images are not for public distribution. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has been very careful about how this information is released." Marcus studied the thermal imaging data on the screen. The pyramid appeared as a three-dimensional wireframe, with different colours indicating temperature variations within the stone. But there, clearly visible in the computer-enhanced images, were several dark voids, empty spaces within the solid limestone structure where no chambers were supposed to exist. "How many voids have you detected?" Marcus asked. "At least 4 significant ones," Dr. Soliman replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 2 above the king's chamber, 1 behind the queen's chamber, and 1 near the base that appears to connect to the subterranean areas. But there's something else. She switched to a different set of images, these taken with ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors. These voids aren't natural. They show clear geometric patterns, right angles, precisely measured dimensions. Someone built these spaces intentionally, then sealed them so completely that they've remained hidden for over 4,000 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Have there been any attempts to access them?" Dr. Solomon's expression grew troubled. "That's where things become political. In 2017, an international team proposed using micro-robotics to explore one of the smaller voids. They had the technology, the funding and preliminary approval from the Archaeological Committee. Then suddenly the project was cancelled. No explanation, no appeal process, just stopped." She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Dr. Chen, I've worked on heritage preservation projects throughout Egypt for 15 years. I've seen government bureaucracy, funding problems, international disputes over archaeological sites. This was different. This was suppression." Marcus thought about his own experience getting research permission. The process had taken 8 months and required letters of recommendation from 3 different universities, a detailed research proposal, and a substantial fee. But even with all that paperwork, his access was limited to already known chambers during specific time windows. "What do you think is in the sealed chambers?" he asked. Dr. Solomon switched to another set of images, these showing electromagnetic anomalies within the hidden voids. These readings suggest metallic objects, not just small artifacts, large structures with geometric patterns. If I had to guess based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'd say we're looking at copper or bronze constructions, possibly in the form of coils or geometric frameworks. Marcus's mind raced. Copper coils would be consistent with his power plant hypothesis. They could serve as electromagnetic conductors or even primitive electrical components. Bronze geometric frameworks might function as focusing elements for electromagnetic energy. "There's something else, Doctor," Solomon continued, bringing up a final image. "This thermal scan was taken during different seasons over a 3-year period. Look at how the temperature signatures in the voids change. The hidden chambers appeared to respond to external conditions, cooling during dry seasons and warming during periods of high humidity. More intriguingly, the temperature variations showed patterns that corresponded to the Nile's traditional flood cycle, even though the river had been controlled by dams for decades. It's as if these chambers are still responding to environmental changes," Dr. Solomon said, "as if whatever system they're part of is still partially functional." Marcus studied the data for several minutes, his theory crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient power plant. It was a machine with components that were still sealed inside, still responding to the same environmental triggers that had activated it thousands of years ago. Dr. Solomon, hypothetically, if someone wanted to access these chambers using modern technology, how would they do it? She looked around the coffee shop nervously. Hypothetically? Millimeter wave radar could map the internal structure precisely. Microbore drilling could create access holes small enough to insert fibre optic cameras. With the right equipment, you could explore these spaces without causing significant structural damage to the pyramid. Marcus nodded, already calculating what such an expedition would cost and how it might be organised. But Dr. Solomon wasn't finished. Dr. Chen, there's something you should know. I'm not the first person to detect these chambers, and I won't be the last. But every researcher who has tried to investigate them seriously has found their access restricted, their funding cut, or their careers redirected. The Egyptian government isn't trying to preserve the pyramid from damage. They're trying to preserve its secrets from discovery. As Marcus walked back through Cairo's bustling streets, he realised he was no longer conducting academic research. He was investigating a cover-up that had been maintained for decades, possibly longer. The question was no longer what the pyramid had been designed to do. It was why someone was so determined to prevent modern science from finding out. That night, Marcus returned to the pyramid alone. Hassan had arranged for him to have extended access, though the guide had seemed reluctant to leave him there as darkness settled over the Giza plateau. Dr. Chen, the pyramid. She's different at night. You be careful, yes? Some knowledge, it comes with price. Now, sitting in absolute darkness in the king's chamber with his instruments powered down and his cell phone turned off, Marcus could feel what Hassan had meant. The vibrations he'd noticed on his first day weren't stronger at night. They were clearer, unmasked by the electromagnetic interference of modern technology and the subtle vibrations of daytime activity. The feeling was unmistakable now, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. It reminded him of sitting in a car with a powerful subwoofer, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest. Except this sensation seemed to penetrate deeper, affecting not just his body but his consciousness itself. Marcus had brought along a new piece of equipment, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector borrowed from Dr. Solomon's laboratory. In the complete darkness and electrical silence of the chamber, the device could register even the faintest electromagnetic activity. He switched it on and watched the display with growing amazement. The pyramid was generating electricity. Not much. The readings were measured in millivolts and microamps, but the output was consistent, rhythmic, and definitely real. The electromagnetic field strength varied in cycles that corresponded to the acoustic resonance he'd measured earlier. The entire structure was functioning as a low-level electrical generator, powered by forces he was only beginning to understand. Marcus activated his night vision camera and began recording, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes he was observing. The electromagnetic readings are strongest near the northeast corner of the chamber, consistent with the acoustic anomalies I documented earlier. The field strength appears to correlate with lunar cycles. Tonight's readings are approximately 20% higher than last week's, coinciding with the new moon. He moved the detector around the chamber, mapping the electromagnetic field as he had mapped the acoustics. The patterns were complex but consistent, forming a three-dimensional matrix of electrical activity that encompassed the entire chamber. At the centre of the room, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus should have been, the electromagnetic field reached its peak intensity. But there was something else. As Marcus sat in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by the electrical field generated by 4,000 years of precisely engineered stone, he began to experience something unexpected, altered consciousness. It started as a subtle shift in perception, similar to the disorientation he'd felt at high altitude or during meditation. But as he remained motionless in the electromagnetic field, the sensation deepened. His thoughts became clearer, more focused, while his awareness of the chamber around him expanded. He could sense the massive weight of the pyramid above him, the underground chambers below, even the subtle movements of air through the shaft systems. Marcus realised that the 110 Hz acoustic resonance he'd measured wasn't accidental. It was the exact frequency that research had shown could induce theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, enhanced creativity, and altered consciousness. Combined with the electromagnetic field, the King's Chamber functioned as a consciousness-altering device. But why? What purpose would ancient builders have had for creating a machine that could systematically alter human consciousness? As Marcus sat in the pyramid's electromagnetic embrace, understanding dawned on him like sunrise over the desert. The pyramid wasn't just a power plant, it was a communication device. The electrical energy it generated wasn't meant to power lights or machinery. It was designed to amplify and transmit human consciousness itself. The ancient Egyptians had built the ultimate meditation chamber, a place where human awareness could be enhanced, expanded, and potentially transmitted across vast distances. The precision engineering, the electromagnetic properties, the acoustic tuning, all of it served to create conditions where consciousness could transcend the normal limitations of the human brain. Marcus thought about the ancient Egyptian concepts of Ka and Ba, aspects of the human soul that could travel beyond the physical body. What if these weren't just religious beliefs, but actual descriptions of consciousness, projection experiences facilitated by the pyramid's technology? The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptians had mastered consciousness projection, they could have explored distant lands without physical travel, communicated across vast distances without messengers, and perhaps even preserved knowledge in ways that transcended physical destruction. The pyramid might have been their internet, their telecommunications network, their method of backing up human consciousness itself. Marcus's instruments continued recording as his awareness expanded further. He could sense other presences in the chamber, not supernatural entities, but echoes of the thousands of people who had experienced altered states in this space over the millennia. The pyramid had been accumulating consciousness, storing it in some form that science didn't yet understand. As the hours passed, Marcus began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient monument, it was a machine for expanding human potential, built by a civilization that understood the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic energy, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. But why had this knowledge been lost, and why were modern authorities so determined to prevent its rediscovery? As dawn approached and the electromagnetic readings began to fluctuate with the rising sun, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his research, and possibly his life. He wasn't going to publish his findings in academic journals where they could be dismissed or suppressed. He was going to find a way to demonstrate the pyramid's true capabilities to the world. The Age of Secrets was about to end. 3 weeks after his night in the King's Chamber, Marcus found himself in a secure conference room at Cairo University, surrounded by researchers who had responded to his carefully worded communications. Dr. Solomon sat across from him, along with Dr. James Morrison, a British archaeoacoustic specialist, Dr. Elena Kozlov, a Russian electromagnetic researcher, and surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Running Bear, a Lakota physicist who studied indigenous sacred sites in North America. "What you're suggesting, Doctor?" "Chen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing Marcus's data on his tablet, "goes beyond revolutionary. You're proposing that ancient civilizations possess technology that we're only beginning to understand." Marcus nodded, pulling up a global map on the room's display screen. Red dots marked locations across every continent. It's not just a proposal anymore. Thanks to Dr. Running Bear's research, we've identified 47 sites worldwide that show identical electromagnetic signatures to the Great Pyramid. Dr. Running Bear leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of generational knowledge. "My people have always known that certain places were different. We called them places where the earth speaks. The acoustic properties, the electromagnetic anomalies, the consciousness-altering effects, they're all documented in our oral traditions." She pointed to several dots in North America. Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Medicine Wheels of Wyoming, certain kivas in the southwest. They all show the same engineering principles, positioning at electromagnetic convergence points, internal geometries designed for acoustic resonance, materials chosen for their piezoelectric properties. Dr. Kozlov, who had been quietly analysing electromagnetic data, looked up with excitement. "I've been comparing the frequency patterns from these sites. They're not random, they form a harmonic sequence. Each site resonates at frequencies that complement the others, as if they were designed to work together as a single system." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A single system spanning the entire globe. More than that, Dr. Kozlov continued, pulling up a complex waveform analysis. If all these sites were activated simultaneously, the combined electromagnetic output would create a standing wave pattern around the Earth. The planet itself would become a resonating chamber. The implications hung heavy in the room. Marcus thought back to his experience in the King's Chamber, the sense of connecting not just to the pyramid, but to something vast and worldwide. Had he been tapping into a dormant global network that once linked human consciousness across continents? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else we need to consider. I've been analysing historical records of these sites, looking for patterns of suppression. It's remarkable how consistently ancient knowledge about these places has been discouraged." He brought up a timeline on his laptop. The Library of Alexandria burned multiple times, always targeting texts about natural philosophy and sacred geometry. The Spanish conquistadors systematically destroyed Mayan and Aztec codices that contained astronomical and architectural knowledge. The British Empire consistently relocated indigenous populations away from sites that showed electromagnetic anomalies. Dr. Running Bear's expression darkened. "My ancestors were forced from sacred sites across North America. The official reason was always agricultural development or mineral rights, but they consistently targeted places where consciousness-altering experiences were known to occur." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same pattern of suppression he'd encountered with the pyramid's hidden chambers was part of a much larger historical trend. Someone, or some group, had been systematically working for centuries to prevent humanity from rediscovering its technological and spiritual heritage. "The question is," Dr. Solomon said quietly, "what would happen if we reactivated this network?" Dr. Solomon's question haunted Marcus for days. The theoretical implications of reactivating an ancient global consciousness network were staggering, but the practical challenges seemed insurmountable. Most of the sites were under government control, protected by restricted access, or surrounded by modern development that would interfere with their electromagnetic properties. But Marcus couldn't let go of what he'd experienced in the King's Chamber. The sense of expanded awareness, of connection to something vast and ancient, had fundamentally changed his understanding of human potential. If that experience could be replicated and shared, it might represent the next stage of human evolution. The answer came from an unexpected source. Hassan appeared at Marcus's hotel room door early one morning, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Doctor, Chen, my family, we have been guardians longer than we have been guides. My great-grandfather, before the British came, before the tourists, he was keeper of the old knowledge." Hassan opened the satchel to reveal documents that made Marcus's breath catch. Hand-drawn maps showing underground passages throughout the Giza Plateau. Detailed diagrams of the pyramid's internal structure, including chambers that weren't on any official archaeological survey. And most remarkably, technical drawings that showed how the pyramid's systems could be manually activated. "The old knowledge, it was never lost completely," Hassan continued. "Hidden, yes. Dangerous to speak of, yes. But preserved by families like mine, waiting for someone who could understand its importance." The drawings revealed that the pyramid's consciousness-amplifying effects weren't automatic. They required specific activation procedures. Water had to be introduced into the subterranean chambers at precise volumes and timing. Certain crystals needed to be placed in the sealed chambers to focus the electromagnetic fields. And most crucially, multiple people had to participate simultaneously, their consciousness working together to achieve resonance with the global network. "Hassan, this is incredible, but how could we possibly implement it? We'd need access to the sealed chambers, permission for extended stays in the pyramid, and coordination with researchers at sites around the world." Hassan smiled, the expression of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. "Dr. Chen, who do you think has been maintaining the pyramid systems all these years? The tourist guides, the security staff, The maintenance workers, many of us are descendants of the original Guardians. We have been waiting for someone like you, someone who could understand what we have been protecting. Over the next few hours, Hassan revealed the existence of a network of Guardians at ancient sites worldwide. Families who had maintained the old knowledge for generations, keeping the sites minimally functional while waiting for the time when they could be fully reactivated. The suppression Marcus had encountered wasn't just from modern governments. It was part of an ancient conflict between those who sought to preserve transformative knowledge and those who feared its implications for existing power structures. But now, Hassan said, his eyes bright with possibility, the time of hiding is ending. The world is ready for the old wisdom to return. Marcus spent the next week in secret meetings with Hassan's network. They showed him hidden passages that connected the pyramids at Giza to underground chambers extending for kilometers beneath the desert. They revealed caches of ancient crystals and metallic components that could be used to restore the pyramid's full functionality. Most remarkably, they demonstrated that they had been maintaining contact with Guardian networks at other sites around the world, using methods that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with modern technology. The plan they developed was audacious beyond anything Marcus had imagined. On the night of the next new moon, when electromagnetic conditions would be optimal, Guardian networks at 12 major sites would simultaneously activate their monuments' consciousness-amplifying systems. The Great Pyramid would serve as the primary node, with Marcus and the research team providing scientific documentation of the process. If successful, the experiment would create the first coordinated activation of the global consciousness network in over 3,000 years. The effects, according to the Guardians' preserved knowledge, would be felt worldwide. A sudden expansion of human awareness that could fundamentally alter the course of civilization. But there were risks. The ancient texts spoke of individuals who'd been unprepared for the experience, whose consciousness had been overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of awareness. There were warnings about the network attracting the attention of forces that had opposed its use in the past, and there was the very real possibility that modern governments would respond to the activation with force, viewing it as a threat to established order. As Marcus stood in the king's chamber 1 week before the planned activation, surrounded by crystals and metallic components that Hassan's people had been safeguarding for millennia, he realized that he was about to participate in either the most important experiment in human history or the most dangerous. The pyramid hummed around him with renewed energy, its systems responding to the presence of the missing components. Through his consciousness, he could sense the other sites coming online around the world, their guardians preparing for an event that would either herald humanity's next evolutionary leap or mark the end of the Age of Secrets forever. The night of the new moon arrived with unprecedented atmospheric conditions. Aurora activity extended far beyond the polar regions, creating shimmering curtains of light visible even in Egypt's desert sky. Electromagnetic storms disrupted satellite communications worldwide, while seismic monitoring stations detected subtle but synchronized vibrations from ancient sites across the globe. Marcus stood in the king's chamber surrounded by Hassan's Guardian network and the international research team. The chamber had been transformed. Crystalline structures now occupied the corners, their faceted surfaces catching and redirecting the subtle light from their instruments. Copper coils, fashioned according to ancient diagrams, had been positioned to enhance the room's natural electromagnetic properties. Most remarkably, water from the Nile's ancient flood channels had been carefully directed into the subterranean chambers, creating the hydraulic pressure needed to activate the pyramid's piezoelectric systems. Dr. Running Bear checked her communication device one final time. Serpent Mound is reporting full activation. The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything we've ever recorded. Dr. Morrison, monitoring from Newgrange and Ireland, transmitted similar reports. The acoustic resonance here is building beyond our measurement capabilities. The entire mound is vibrating in harmony with frequencies we didn't know existed. Around the world, Guardian networks at sites from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat were reporting the same phenomenon. Ancient monuments that had been dormant for millennia were awakening. their consciousness-amplifying systems responding to coordinated activation for the first time in recorded history. In the King's Chamber, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of expanded awareness beginning to build, but this time it was different, stronger, more focused, and connected to something vast beyond individual consciousness. Through the electromagnetic field generated by the activated pyramid, he could sense the presence of people at the other sites, their awareness merging into a collective experience that transcended physical distance. Dr. Kozlov, monitoring the electromagnetic readings, whispered in amazement, "The standing wave pattern is forming exactly as predicted. The Earth's electromagnetic field is reorganizing itself around these sites." But the experience went beyond scientific measurement. As the network reached full activation, Marcus found his consciousness expanding not just across space but across time. He could sense the pyramid builders themselves, not as historical figures but as present awareness, as if their consciousness had been preserved within the structure itself, waiting for this moment of reactivation. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just built a machine for amplifying consciousness, they had created a means of preserving it across millennia. The pyramid was a library of human awareness, containing the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved levels of understanding that modern science was only beginning to approach. Through the network, Marcus experienced visions of the ancient world as it had truly been. Not the primitive civilization described in history textbooks, but a global culture connected by consciousness-amplifying technology, capable of feats that seemed magical only because the principles had been forgotten. He saw the construction of the monuments not as slave labour directed by megalomaniacal pharaohs, but as collaborative projects undertaken by people who understood their role in maintaining humanity's connection to higher levels of awareness. Most remarkably, he experienced the reason why the network had been deactivated. As human civilizations became more hierarchical and centralized, the egalitarian consciousness expansion technology had been seen as a threat to emerging power structures. Rulers who depended on controlling information and limiting awareness had systematically dismantled the network, replacing consciousness-expanding wisdom traditions with belief systems that emphasized obedience and separation. The suppression hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, coordinated across cultures and centuries by those who understood that widespread access to expanded consciousness would make traditional forms of dominance impossible to maintain. But the network had been designed with safeguards. The consciousness of its builders had been preserved within the structures themselves, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its heritage. That time, Marcus realized, was now. As the activation reached its peak, effects began manifesting around the world. Dr. Running Bear reported that people living near the activated sites were spontaneously experiencing expanded states of consciousness. Emergency services were receiving calls about strange lights and telepathic experiences. Social media was flooded with reports of sudden insights, creative breakthroughs, and experiences of connection that transcended normal human limitations. But there was resistance as well. Military aircraft were scrambling towards several of the activated sites. Government communications were buzzing with references to unauthorized experiments and potential security threats. The same forces that had suppressed the ancient knowledge were mobilizing to contain its return. Hassan, who had been monitoring communications with Guardian networks worldwide, turned to Marcus with urgent concern. "Doctor, Chen, we have perhaps 30 minutes before official intervention begins. The network is fully activated, but maintaining it will require ongoing commitment from people around the world." Marcus understood. The ancient network hadn't been maintained by technology alone. It had required conscious participation from people who understood its importance. The reactivation was just the beginning. For the consciousness-expanding effects to continue, individuals at sites around the world would need to take responsibility for maintaining the system, despite inevitable opposition from established power structures. As sirens began wailing in the distance and the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon, Marcus made his final recordings. The scientific data would be crucial for documenting what had occurred, but the real proof would be the ongoing transformation of human consciousness that the network had initiated. The age of secrets was truly ending. But as Marcus and his team prepared to face the consequences of their world-changing experiment, he realized that the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the Global Awakening, as the media had dubbed it, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Prague, one of dozens of cities where consciousness research centres had spontaneously emerged. Around the world, people who had experienced the network activation had begun gathering, sharing their experiences and developing new applications for expanded awareness. The official response had been predictable. Governments had classified the event as a coordinated hoax involving atmospheric anomalies and mass suggestion. The Guardian networks had been disbanded, the sites placed under increased security, and several researchers had found their careers and funding mysteriously terminated. But the consciousness genie was out of the bottle. Dr. Running Bear, now leading a consortium of indigenous researchers, had documented over 10,000 cases of enhanced psychic abilities manifesting in people who had been near activated sites. Dr. Kozlov was working with a network of physicists who had detected fundamental changes in quantum field behaviour around former network locations. Even Dr. Morrison, despite losing his university position, continued documenting the ongoing acoustic anomalies at ancient sites worldwide. Most remarkably, people were spontaneously rediscovering consciousness expansion techniques that had been lost for millennia. Meditation practices, acoustic healing methods, and electromagnetic sensitivity training were emerging independently in communities around the globe, as if the network activation had reawakened dormant human capabilities. Hassan had become something of a folk hero in Egypt, his family's guardianship role finally acknowledged by people who had experienced the pyramid's true power. Though official access remained restricted, underground tours of the pyramid's hidden systems had become a pilgrimage for those seeking direct experience of expanded consciousness. Marcus himself had changed profoundly. The night in the activated King's Chamber had left him with permanent access to expanded awareness states. He could sense the electromagnetic fields of other people, communicate telepathically with others who had experienced the network, and access information through methods that conventional science couldn't explain. But perhaps the most significant change was happening at a societal level. The consciousness expansion experienced by millions of people worldwide had created a generation less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of independent thinking, and naturally inclined toward cooperation rather than competition. Political movements based on fear and division were finding it increasingly difficult to gain traction. Economic systems that depended on artificial scarcity and manufactured desire were being replaced by resource-sharing networks organised through enhanced human communication abilities. The ancient pyramid builders' greatest achievement wasn't the monuments themselves, it was the civilization they had made possible. A society where expanded consciousness was the norm rather than the exception, where human potential was fully realised, and where technology served to enhance rather than replace natural human capabilities. As Marcus finished his coffee and prepared for another day of documenting the ongoing transformation, he reflected on the pyramid's true message. The structure itself had been important, but it was ultimately just a tool. The real power had always been within human consciousness itself, the capacity for awareness to expand, connect, and transcend the limitations that seemed so absolute. The pyramids had been built not to house the dead, but to awaken the living, and after 4,000 years of slumber, humanity was finally ready to reclaim its birthright. Standing in the Prague sunlight, Marcus could sense the presence of others around the world who had experienced the awakening. Through the invisible network that still connected activated sites, he felt their determination to ensure that the consciousness-expanding knowledge would never again be lost or suppressed. They told us the pyramids were tombs, but standing here, I know that's a lie. This wasn't built to bury the dead. It was built to keep the world alive, to preserve and transmit the highest potentials of human consciousness across the millennia, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its forgotten heritage. That time had finally come. The age of expanded consciousness had begun, and no force on earth could put the awakened human spirit back to sleep. The network hummed silently across the globe, connecting minds and hearts in ways that transcended physical distance. The ancient Guardian's work was complete. The future of human consciousness stretched ahead like dawn breaking over the desert, infinite with possibility. Marcus smiled, feeling the pyramid's eternal presence in his consciousness, and stepped forward into humanity's transformed tomorrow. What if the most powerful secret society in history wasn't the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, or even the modern Freemasons, but three men whose names have been deliberately erased from every record? Tonight, we dive deep into the digital shadows to uncover a conspiracy so intricate, so carefully hidden, that discovering it might be the last thing you ever do. Before we begin, what conspiracy would you like us to investigate next? Ancient bloodlines controlling world governments, the real purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even darker lurking in the depths of the internet? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more late-night investigations that will keep you awake long after the credits roll. The blue glow of Dorian Cade's monitors cast long shadows across his cluttered apartment at 3:47 a.m. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his workstation, where 4 screens displayed cascading lines of encrypted data. This was his domain, the digital underworld where secrets lived and died in streams of code. Dorian had always been drawn to the spaces between spaces, the forgotten corners of the internet where truth hid behind layers of encryption. By day, he was just another cybersecurity analyst for Titan Defense Systems, debugging firewalls and hunting malware. But by night, he was something else entirely, a digital archaeologist, excavating buried information from the deepest recesses of the web. Tonight's target was a seemingly innocuous file archive he'd discovered on a defunct server that once belonged to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The files were old, some dating back to the early digitization efforts of the 1990s, when historical documents were first being converted from physical to digital formats. Most of it was mundane: meeting minutes, membership rolls, financial records, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep. But Dorian wasn't most people. As his decryption algorithms worked through the data, something unusual caught his attention. Buried within a folder labelled Historical Correspondence MISC was a file that didn't match the others. The metadata was wrong, the encryption was different, and when he finally cracked it open, what he found made his pulse quicken. It was a single image, a symbol he had never seen before. 3 interlocked triangles formed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Each triangle was perfectly equilateral, but where they intersected, strange geometric forms emerged, creating an optical illusion that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Beneath the symbol was a single line of text, the triune accord established. 1717 AVCRJH. Dorian leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. 1717. That was the same year the Grand Lodge of London was established, marking the beginning of organised Freemasonry. But what was the Triune Accord, and who were A, V, CR and JH? He screenshotted the image and began reverse searching it through every database he could access. Nothing. No matches, No similar images, no references anywhere on the indexed internet. It was as if this symbol existed in a void, completely disconnected from the digital world. The mystery deepened when he examined the file's digital signature. According to the metadata, this document had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past 30 years, but always by anonymous users with no traceable digital footprints. Someone, or multiple someones, had been maintaining this file, keeping it alive in the digital space while ensuring it remained invisible to casual observers. Dorian's hands moved instinctively to his keyboard. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found, touched something that wasn't supposed to be touched. And now, he couldn't let it go. The hunt had begun. 3 days of relentless searching had yielded fragments, tantalizing pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Dorian had barely slept, surviving on caffeine and the electric thrill of discovery. His apartment had transformed into a conspiracy theorist's dream, with printed documents taped to every available wall surface and red string connecting seemingly random data points. The breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the initials A, V, CR, and JH with historical Masonic records from the early 18th century. Traditional sources yielded nothing, but when he dug into the darker corners of academic databases, forgotten doctoral dissertations, obscure historical journals, private collections that had been digitized but never properly indexed, patterns began to emerge. In a 1987 thesis on esoteric influences in early American politics, he found a footnote referencing 3 mysterious benefactors who had allegedly provided funding for the construction of several early American government buildings. The author had dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated rumours, but had noted that the same 3 sets of initials appeared in financial records from Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston between 1720 and 1750. A deeper dive into banking archives from the period revealed something extraordinary. Dorian discovered a series of encrypted letters between European aristocrats and early American colonists, all revolving around something called the Doctrine of Quiet Influence. The letters, written in a cipher that had taken him 2 full days to crack, described a methodology for guiding human behaviour through subtle manipulation of symbols, language, and social structures. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. The letters were signed with the same initials, AV, CR, and JH. According to the correspondence, these 3 men weren't just wealthy benefactors. They were the architects of a new form of power, one that didn't rely on armies or political office, but on the manipulation of human psychology itself. They had studied the old mystery schools, the ancient techniques of persuasion and control, and had adapted them for a new age. One letter, dated 1734, was particularly chilling. The masses believe they choose their own thoughts, their own desires, their own leaders. They do not understand that choice itself can be manufactured, shaped like clay in the hands of those who understand the deeper mechanics of the human mind. We 3 have laid the foundation stones. Future generations will build upon our work without ever knowing our names. Dorian printed out the letter and pinned it to his wall next to the symbol of the 3 interlocked triangles. The pattern was starting to make sense. These weren't just random geometric shapes. They were a visual representation of the 3 founders' methodology. Each triangle represented a different sphere of influence: political, economic, and cultural. Where they intersected, control was established. But who were they? The initials were all he had to go on, and despite hours of searching, he couldn't find any historical figures from the period whose names matched. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record. That's when he made his second major discovery. Hidden within the financial records was a reference to something called the Lodge of 3 Pillars. Not an official Masonic lodge, but what appeared to be a secret organisation within the larger Masonic structure. The 3 pillars, according to the documents, were AV, CR, and JH themselves. Dorian's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. He was uncovering something that had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. The deeper he dug, the more he realised that this wasn't just history. It was a blueprint, a framework that was still being used. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through his apartment windows, Dorian stared at the wall of evidence he'd assembled. The three Masons, as he had begun calling them, had created more than just a secret society. They had engineered a system of control that devolved and adapted over centuries, invisible but omnipresent. And now he was beginning to understand how it worked. The realization hit Dorian like a physical blow as he sat in his favourite coffee shop, laptop open, surrounded by the mundane chatter of the morning commuters. He had been analysing media patterns for the past week, looking for connections to the doctrine of quiet influence, when the data suddenly cohered into a terrifying picture. It was everywhere. The three interlocked triangles, the symbol of the triune accord, weren't just hidden in dusty historical archives. They were embedded in the fabric of modern culture, disguised and abstracted but unmistakably present. Movie logos, corporate brands, architectural designs, even the layout of popular websites, all contained subtle variations of the three-triangle pattern. Dorian's hand shook as he scrolled through his analysis. He had developed an algorithm to detect geometric patterns that matched the mathematical relationships inherent in the original symbol. The results were overwhelming. Major Hollywood studios, Fortune 500 companies, news networks and social media platforms all incorporated elements of the design into their visual identity. But it went deeper than logos and branding. The doctrine of quiet influence, as described in the 18th century letters, relied on three key principles: repetition, authority, and emotional resonance. Dorian began to see these principles reflected in everything from political campaigns to advertising strategies to social media algorithms. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he dove deeper into the pattern recognition data. Primetime television shows contained dialogue structures that followed specific linguistic patterns outlined in the historical documents. Popular songs used chord progressions and lyrical frameworks that aligned with the emotional manipulation techniques described in the letters. Even children's programming seemed to incorporate subliminal messaging systems derived from the three Masons' psychological frameworks. The most disturbing discovery came when he analysed news broadcasts from the past decade. Major networks, regardless of their political orientation, used nearly identical linguistic structures when reporting on controversial topics. The language was designed to create emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis, exactly as the doctrine had prescribed. Dorian closed his laptop and walked home in a daze. His apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge he carried. Every advertisement on the subway, every billboard along the street, every notification on his phone, they all looked different through the lens of what he now understood. That evening he began compiling a comprehensive digital archive of his findings. If what he suspected was true, if the three Masons' influence had not only survived but thrived in the modern era, then someone needed to document it. He created encrypted backups of everything: the historical documents, his analysis algorithms, the pattern recognition data, his own notes and theories. As he worked, a new question haunted him. If the three Masons had successfully embedded their control systems into modern society, who was running those systems now? The original architects had died centuries ago, but their work lived on. Someone was maintaining it, updating it, ensuring its continued effectiveness. Dorian pulled up recent financial records from some of the corporations that featured the strongest pattern matches. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anonymous investors. The ownership structures were labyrinthine, designed to obscure rather than reveal. But patterns emerged here too. The same investment firms appeared again and again, the same legal structures, the same carefully anonymized board members. It was a network, vast and interconnected, spanning industries and continents, and at its heart Dorian was beginning to suspect were the modern inheritors of the three Masons' legacy. He named his archive the Veil Project and began preparing it for release. The world had a right to know about the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, but as he prepared to upload his findings to multiple whistleblower platforms, his computer screen flickered. For just a moment, the 3 interlocked triangles appeared in the corner of his monitor. There and gone so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. The message appeared in Dorian's private encrypted chat channel at 2:33 a.m, exactly 72 hours after he had discovered the pattern recognition data. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the message itself was anything but anonymous. It was clearly directed at him, containing details that only someone who had been watching his research could know. The 3 still watch. Stop now, Dorian. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had been so careful, using multiple layers of encryption, routing his traffic through a dozen different proxy servers, maintaining operational security that should have made him invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance operations. But they had found him. He ran a full system scan, checking for malware, backdoors, any sign of compromise. His security software came back clean, but Dorian knew that meant nothing. If someone had the resources to track his research, despite his precautions, they would also have the resources to hide their presence on his system. The paranoia began slowly, like a low-grade fever. Every notification on his phone made him jump. Every knock on his apartment door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started noticing things that might have been coincidences. The same car parked outside his building for 3 days, a man in a coffee shop who looked away too quickly when Dorian glanced in his direction. The second message arrived 48 hours later, this time containing a photograph. It showed Dorian sitting at his computer, taken from inside his own apartment. The timestamp indicated it had been captured the previous night while he worked on the Veil project. Someone had been inside his home. Dorian immediately conducted a physical sweep of his apartment. He found the device hidden inside the frame of his bedroom mirror. A microcamera so small he almost missed it, connected to a transmitter that was broadcasting his every move to an unknown receiver. But the camera was just the beginning. A more thorough search revealed audio pickups in his kitchen and living room, keystroke loggers attached to his computer equipment, and something that looked like a network tap spliced into his Ethernet cable. His entire life was being monitored. The rational part of his mind told him to stop, to destroy his research and return to his normal life. But Dorian had never been particularly rational. The invasion of his privacy, rather than deterring him, only confirmed that he was onto something significant. You didn't deploy military-grade surveillance equipment against someone who was chasing shadows. He began operating under the assumption that everything he did was being watched. He established new research protocols, using air-gapped computers and physical storage devices that never connected to the internet. He moved his most sensitive work to a storage unit across town, accessible only by physical key. He varied his routines, took different routes to work, paid for everything in cash, but the watchers adapted too. His work computer at Titan Defense Systems began experiencing mysterious glitches. Files would disappear and reappear. His security clearance was subjected to routine reviews that felt anything but routine. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed distant, their conversations stilted and careful. The third message was different. Instead of a text, he received a link to a news article about a cybersecurity researcher in Seattle who had died in a car accident. The researcher, according to the article, had been working on sensitive projects related to digital privacy and surveillance. The accident had occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a straight stretch of highway, with no other vehicles involved. Dorian noticed that the timestamp on the article was exactly 3 minutes before he received the link. The message was clear: this could happen to you. But by then, Dorian was too deep to surface. The Veil project had expanded beyond his original scope, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He had uncovered something that went beyond historical curiosity or academic research. The Three Masons weren't just a fascinating historical footnote, they were the architects of a system that was still actively shaping human society. And someone was willing to kill to keep that secret hidden. That night, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to find him first. He began preparations for what he called Project Deep Dive, A final comprehensive investigation that would either expose the truth about the three Masons or confirm his own paranoid delusions. Either way, he would have his answer. As he packed his research materials and prepared to disappear into the digital underground, Dorian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked like a man who had seen too much, learned too much, gone too far down a rabbit hole that might not have an exit. But he also looked like a man who was finally fully alive. The abandoned subway station beneath downtown had been closed since 1962, but Dorian's research had revealed that its tunnels connected to a network of service corridors that ran beneath several government buildings. More importantly, the location offered something he desperately needed: complete isolation from digital surveillance. He had spent 3 days preparing his mobile command centre. Military-grade Faraday cages protected his equipment from electronic monitoring. Satellite internet connections routed through multiple international proxies provided connectivity that would be nearly impossible to trace. Battery packs and portable generators ensured he could operate for weeks without external power. The setup looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic thriller, and Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that it might represent his future. A life spent in the shadows, hunted by forces he barely understood. But it was here, in the depths beneath the city, that he finally breached what he had come to think of as the vault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analysing the financial networks he had discovered, Dorian noticed that several key transactions were processed through a server cluster housed in the Smithsonian Institution's digital archive facility. The Smithsonian servers weren't just repositories for historical documents. They were hosting active financial systems for the network of corporations connected to the Three Masons pattern. Using exploit tools from his defence contractor days, Dorian tunnelled into the archive system through a maintenance portal that had been forgotten during a security update. What he found inside defied his wildest expectations. The vault wasn't a single database, it was an entire hidden internet, a shadow network that existed parallel to the visible web. Accessible only through specific cryptographic keys that appeared to be distributed to a select group of users, the vault contained terabytes of data spanning 3 centuries. The most recent files were mind-bending. Detailed psychological profiles of world leaders, media manipulation strategies updated in real time, algorithmic frameworks for managing public opinion through social media platforms. But it was the historical archives that truly shocked him. Digitized manuscripts described secret chambers beneath Washington, D.C., built during the Capitol's construction according to specifications provided by the Three Masons. The chambers weren't just meeting spaces. They were designed as psychological amplification devices, using acoustic engineering and symbolic geometry to enhance the persuasive power of those who spoke within them. Architectural drawings showed that the entire layout of the Capitol building, the White House, and the Supreme Court formed a massive version of the 3 interlocked triangles when viewed from above. The buildings weren't just symbols of American democracy, they were active components in a system designed to channel and focus political influence. But the most disturbing documents dealt with something called the Great Work, an ongoing project to gradually reshape human consciousness through systematic manipulation of culture, education, and information systems. The Great Work wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was presented as a form of guided evolution, helping humanity develop according to principles established by the Three Masons. According to the documents, every major social movement of the past 2 centuries had been either initiated or co-opted by the inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. Wars, revolutions, technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, all were pieces in a vast game being played by invisible hands. And Dorian discovered that modern political speeches were crafted using linguistic frameworks, derived directly from the original doctrine of quiet influence. Presidential debates, congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, all followed scripted patterns designed to produce predetermined emotional responses in viewers. Entertainment media was even more thoroughly controlled. Hollywood studios, record labels, publishing houses, all were connected to the network through complex ownership structures. Popular culture wasn't a reflection of society's values. It was a tool for shaping those values. As Dorian delved deeper into the vault, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a historical conspiracy. It was a living system, constantly evolving and adapting to new technologies and social conditions. The three Masons had died centuries ago, but their work lived on through institutions, traditions and methodologies that had become so embedded in society that they were virtually invisible. The most chilling realization came when he discovered his own file in the vault's database. They had been monitoring him for months, tracking his research, analysing his psychological profile, preparing countermeasures. His investigation hadn't been a secret quest for truth. It had been a carefully observed experiment. But why let him discover so much? Why allow him to penetrate their most sensitive archives? The answer came in a document titled Protocol 7, Asset Integration. Dorian's blood ran cold as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological profile, his motivations, his likely responses to various stimuli. He wasn't just a threat to be eliminated, he was a potential asset to be recruited. The file indicated that his research skills and psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for voluntary integration into their network. His investigation of the three Masons hadn't been a violation of their security, it had been an audition. As this understanding washed over him, Dorian noticed something that made his hands shake. The documents he was accessing contained metadata signatures, hidden markers that traced every query back to his specific location and identity. By exploring the vault, he wasn't just learning their secrets, he was leaving digital fingerprints that proved he had been there. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself at 4:47 a.m. on what Dorian would later realise was his last night of freedom. He had been analysing the most recent uploads to the vault, real-time data feeds that showed the three Masons' influence network in active operation. What he discovered was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The network wasn't just influencing culture and politics. It was actively shaping reality itself through coordinated manipulation of information systems. Social media algorithms were tweaked to promote specific narratives. Search engine results were subtly adjusted to guide public research toward predetermined conclusions. News recommendation systems were programmed to create echo chambers that reinforced desired belief patterns. But the most sophisticated element was something they called consensus engineering. By carefully managing the flow of information across multiple platforms simultaneously, the network could create the illusion that certain ideas were organically emerging from grassroots movements, when in fact they were being systematically planted and cultivated. Dorian watched in real time as a coordinated information campaign was launched across dozens of platforms. A political controversy that would dominate news cycles for weeks was being artificially created through carefully timed leaks, strategic social media posts, and coordinated commentary from influencers who probably didn't even realise they were part of the operation. The level of coordination was staggering. Television networks, newspapers, social media platforms, and even individual bloggers were all receiving talking points through channels that appeared unconnected but were actually part of a single centralised command structure. He began documenting everything, screenshotting real-time operations, copying database entries, building an irrefutable record of the network in action. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for, proof that modern society was being manipulated by invisible forces operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. But as he prepared to copy the most damaging files to his secure storage devices, Dorian noticed something that made his blood freeze. The documents he was accessing contained more than just information. They contained active code that was executing on his system every time he opened a file. He ran an immediate diagnostic and discovered the horrifying truth. Every document in the vault was embedded with sophisticated tracking malware. Not only did the system know exactly what he had accessed, it had been installing backdoors and surveillance tools on his equipment from the moment he had first breached their security. His air-gapped computers weren't air-gapped anymore. His encrypted storage devices were compromised. His Faraday cages were useless against software that was already inside his systems. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As he traced the malware's network connections, Dorian realized that his entire investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The original files he had discovered in the Masonic Lodge archive. They had been placed there deliberately, designed to attract someone with his specific skill set and psychological profile. The research trails he had followed, the connections he had discovered, the patterns he had uncovered, all of it had been a carefully constructed puzzle, leading him step by step to this moment. He hadn't been investigating the three Masons, he had been recruited by them. The recruitment wasn't complete yet. According to the protocols he found in his own file, the final step required a conscious choice. He could accept integration into their network, becoming a willing participant in the great work, or he could face the consequences of possessing knowledge that wasn't meant for outsiders. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new message appeared on his screen. "Dorian, you have seen behind the veil. There are only two paths forward. Choose wisely." Below the message were two links. The first was labelled Integration. The second was labelled Termination. Dorian stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications of everything he had discovered. The three Masons weren't the villains in this story, at least not from their perspective. They saw themselves as shepherds of human civilization, guiding society toward what they believed was a better future. The manipulation, the control, the systematic shaping of human consciousness, all of it was presented as necessary stewardship of a species too chaotic and self-destructive to govern itself effectively. But Dorian couldn't shake the image of humanity as a vast puppet show, with invisible hands pulling strings that the puppets couldn't even see. Was guided evolution really better than free will? Was managed consciousness preferable to authentic chaos? The choice before him wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in, and what kind of person he wanted to be within that world. As he reached for his mouse to make his selection, Dorian heard something that made his blood run cold. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Time was up. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above was unmistakable. Heavy boots, moving with military precision, getting closer with each passing second. Dorian's hands flew across his keyboard as he initiated emergency protocols, wiping drives, destroying evidence, preparing for what he now realized was inevitable. The sirens had been a psychological prompt designed to create urgency and force a hasty decision. The real trap was much more elegant than simple law enforcement intervention. As Dorian frantically tried to secure his data, he discovered that his internet connection had been severed, not blocked, completely terminated at the infrastructure level. His backup satellite connections were jammed. His cellular network showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections. Even his emergency radio beacon was transmitting into empty air, its signals absorbed by sophisticated countermeasures he couldn't detect, but could feel pressing in around him like invisible walls. The isolation was complete and professional. Whoever was coming for him had surrounded him not just physically, but digitally, cutting off every possible avenue of communication or escape. But Dorian had one final card to play. Before establishing his underground command centre, he had prepared a dead man's switch, an automated system that would release his entire archive if he failed to check in within a specific time window. The system was housed on a server cluster in Eastern Europe, completely disconnected from his current location and impossible to trace back to him through conventional means. At least that's what he had believed. As he tried to access the dead man's switch, Dorian discovered that it too had been compromised. The activation codes had been changed, the server locations had been altered, and his backup authentication systems had been systematically disabled. Somehow they had anticipated and countered even his most paranoid contingency plans. The footsteps stopped directly above his hiding place. In the silence that followed, Dorian finally understood the true nature of the trap. He hadn't just been recruited, he had been studied, analysed, and predicted with mechanical precision. Every move he had made, every precaution he had taken, every paranoid contingency he had prepared, had been anticipated and accounted for. His investigation hadn't been a threat to their operations, it had been a demonstration of their capabilities. A voice echoed down from the tunnel above, calm and professional. "Mr. Cade, We need to talk." Dorian looked around his underground command centre. The sophisticated equipment, the military-grade security measures, the careful preparations that had taken weeks to implement. All of it was useless now. He had been allowed to build this fortress so that they could demonstrate how easily it could be bypassed. The voice continued. "Your research has been impressive. Your skills are exactly what we've been looking for. But the recruitment process needs to be completed according to protocol." Protocol. Everything with them was protocol, systematic and methodical. Even rebellion had to follow their rules, serve their purposes, advance their agenda. As the first figures began descending into his underground sanctuary, Dorian made one final desperate attempt to access his archive. If he could just upload something, anything, to prove that the three Masons were real and active, maybe someone else would continue the investigation. But his screens had already gone dark. His equipment was shutting down in sequence, responding to override commands that bypassed every security system he had installed. They weren't just capturing him, they were demonstrating complete dominance over his digital domain. The lead figure removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile. She looked more like a librarian than a Black Ops operative, but her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, Dorian," she said warmly. "My name is Dr. Ellen Drew, and I represent the contemporary stewards of the great work. You've impressed us greatly with your research, but I'm afraid you've also created a security situation that needs to be resolved." Dorian found his voice. "You mean eliminated?" Dr. Drew shook her head. "Integration, actually. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be much more valuable as a willing participant than as a cautionary tale. The choice is still yours, but I should mention that the termination option from earlier was never really on the table. We've invested too much in your development to waste that potential." As she spoke, Dorian realised that even his moment of apparent choice had been an illusion. The integration process had already begun the moment he first accessed their files. Every revelation, every discovery, every moment of apparent rebellion had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this point. He wasn't being recruited, he was being harvested. Dr. Drew gestured to the equipment surrounding them. "All of this will be preserved, of course. Your research will continue, but with proper resources and institutional support. The three Masons' work is too important to be left to individual initiative, no matter how talented." Dorian stared at the woman who held his future in her hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be experiencing a very realistic simulation of refusal, while your consciousness is gradually adjusted to accept integration. We've found that the illusion of choice makes the process more comfortable for everyone involved. The trap was perfect because it had no exit. Resistance would be futile because resistance was part of the design. Even this conversation, even his growing horror at the situation, was probably being factored into some psychological algorithm designed to optimize his eventual compliance." As the implication sank in, Dorian felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his attachment to the idea that any of this had ever been real. His investigation, his discoveries, his moment of revelation, all of it had been a carefully crafted performance designed to transform him into whatever they needed him to become. The three Masons weren't just controlling society, they were controlling him. And the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to understand why. 6 months after Dorian Cade disappeared from his apartment in the middle of the night, fragments of his research began surfacing on obscure internet forums. Anonymous uploads appeared on file-sharing networks, containing encrypted archives that told a story of conspiracy and control spanning 3 centuries. The uploads were sporadic and seemingly random. A few documents here, some analysis there, portions of what appeared to be a larger investigation into something called the Three Masons. The files generated intense discussion in certain corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists, digital privacy advocates, and researchers into esoteric history all found elements that resonated with their particular interests. But the fragments raised more questions than they answered. The documentation was sophisticated enough to suggest serious research, but incomplete enough to prevent any definitive conclusions. The historical elements were intriguingly plausible, but unverifiable through conventional sources. The contemporary analysis contained insights into media manipulation and social control that seemed prescient but could easily be dismissed as paranoid speculation. Some investigators tried to trace the uploads back to their source, but the digital trails led nowhere. The files appeared and disappeared from servers around the world, uploaded by anonymous accounts that vanished as quickly as they had been created. Whoever was releasing this information had sophisticated technical capabilities and an intimate understanding of how to remain invisible in the digital landscape. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the archive fragments contained embedded metadata, hidden signatures that seemed to reference additional materials that had never been released. The signatures suggested that what they were seeing was only a small portion of a much larger collection of evidence. But where was the rest of the archive? And who was controlling its release? Theories proliferated across discussion forums and social media platforms. Some believed that Dorian Cade had been silenced by the very forces he was investigating, and that the leaked materials were being released by automated systems he had established as insurance. Others suggested that the entire thing was an elaborate alternate reality game, designed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. A few researchers claimed to have identified patterns in the release schedule that aligned with significant political events or cultural developments. The fragments seemed to appear at moments when they would have maximum relevance to current affairs, as if someone was curating their release to maximize impact. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the leaks were intentional, not the work of a whistleblower or an automated system, but a deliberate information campaign designed to achieve some larger purpose. If the three Masons really existed, and if they really controlled information systems as thoroughly as the document suggested, then wouldn't they also control the narrative of their own exposure? Late-night researchers who delved too deeply into the Cade archive reported strange experiences, computer glitches that seemed too targeted to be random, internet searches that returned results that disappeared when accessed again, social media algorithms that seemed to actively suppress discussion of certain topics. Some claimed to have received anonymous messages warning them away from the investigation. Others reported that their research was being monitored by unknown parties. A few simply stopped posting one day, their accounts going silent without explanation. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Those who got closest to understanding the true scope of Dorian's discoveries seemed to encounter obstacles that discouraged further research. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or technical malfunction. But the cumulative effect was to ensure that the investigation never reached critical mass. And so the mystery of Dorian Cade and the three Masons remained unsolved, existing in the liminal space between truth and fiction, between revelation and misdirection. The fragments continued to circulate, generating discussion and debate, but never quite coalescing into anything that could definitively prove or disprove the central claims. The most dedicated researchers began to notice something peculiar about their own investigations. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves questioning not just the truth of Dorian's discoveries, but the nature of truth itself. If information could be so thoroughly controlled and manipulated, how could anyone be certain that their own thoughts and conclusions were authentic? One researcher, posting under the username Digital Veil, claimed to have reconstructed portions of Dorian's methodology and arrived at similar conclusions about media manipulation and social control. But when other investigators tried to verify the research, they found that the evidence cited by Digital Veil led to websites that no longer existed, documents that had been removed from archives, and source materials that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to access them independently. Was Digital Veil continuing Dorian's work? Or was Digital Veil part of the very system Dorian had claimed to expose? The question became even more complex when Digital Veil began posting increasingly sophisticated analysis that seemed to predict social and political developments with uncanny accuracy. The posts described how specific news events would unfold, how public opinion would shift in response to carefully crafted messaging campaigns, and how seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena were actually coordinated elements of larger influence operations. and the predictions kept coming true. But rather than proving the existence of the Three Masons conspiracy, Digital Veil's accurate predictions only deepened the mystery. Were they based on genuine insider knowledge of how the system operated, or were they simply the result of careful observation of existing patterns? Was Digital Veil exposing the conspiracy or participating in it? The final post from Digital Veil came exactly 1 year after Dorian Cade's disappearance. It consisted of a single image, the 3 interlocked triangles that had started Dorian's investigation, accompanied by a brief message. The research continues. The watchers become the watched. The hunters become the hunted. Truth is not a destination but a journey, and some journeys are designed to change the traveller more than the destination. Dorian understood this in the end. He chose integration not because he was forced to, but because he realised that the only way to truly oppose the system was to understand it from within. The Three Masons were never the enemy. They were teachers, waiting for students ready to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power is not something you take. Power is something you become. The archive is complete, the circle is closed, the great work continues. Decay. The message sparked intense debate across conspiracy forums and research communities. Was this really from Dorian Cade, suggesting that he had willingly joined the organisation he had been investigating? Was it a fake message designed to discredit his research? Or was it something more subtle, a coded communication from someone operating deep within the system Dorian had tried to expose? No one could agree on the interpretation, and perhaps that was the point. The message was designed to be ambiguous, to raise questions rather than answer them, to ensure that the investigation would continue but never reach a definitive conclusion. In the months that followed, the Dorian Cade archive gradually faded from active discussion. New conspiracy theories emerged to capture the attention of digital investigators. New mysteries arose to challenge those who sought hidden truths. The Three Masons, if they existed, returned to the shadows where they had always operated most effectively. But for those who had followed the investigation closely, something had changed. They found themselves looking at the world differently, noticing patterns they had never seen before, questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. They began to see the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, even if they couldn't prove its existence to others. Some researchers reported that they had begun to incorporate elements of the doctrine of quiet influence into their own work, not to manipulate others, but to better understand how they themselves were being manipulated. They studied the psychological techniques described in Dorian's files, the linguistic frameworks, the symbolic systems, the methodologies for shaping human consciousness. A few claim to have achieved a kind of immunity to mass manipulation through this understanding. They described a state of hyper-awareness where they could observe the influence systems operating around them without being affected by them. They called it seeing through the veil. But others wondered if this supposed immunity was itself an illusion, if the system was sophisticated enough to make people believe they had escaped its influence, while actually drawing them deeper into its web. After all, what better way to control someone than to convince them they couldn't be controlled? The question that haunted all serious researchers into the Dorian Cade mystery was whether the investigation had revealed the truth about hidden systems of control, or whether it had been a demonstration of those systems in action. Had they uncovered a conspiracy, or had they been recruited into one? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that there was no meaningful difference between the two options. The final entry in what researchers believed to be Dorian's original archive was a single text file, uploaded anonymously to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. It contained no metadata, no digital signatures, no clues about its origin. The message was brief but haunting. If you are reading this, you have already been chosen. The investigation never ends. It only changes investigators. Welcome to the great work. Your orientation will begin shortly. Below the message was a simple instruction. Look around you. Really look. The signs are everywhere, once you know how to see them. And indeed, those who followed the instruction began to notice things. Symbols in corporate logos that matched patterns from the historical documents. Linguistic structures in news broadcasts that aligned with psychological manipulation frameworks. social media algorithms that seem to nudge users towards specific conclusions without their awareness. The three Masons weren't hiding in the shadows, they were hiding in plain sight, their influence so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern society that it had become invisible through ubiquity. They didn't need to silence investigators because they had created a world where the truth was indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. And perhaps that was the most elegant control system of all, a reality so thoroughly constructed that even those who glimpsed behind the veil couldn't be certain whether they had discovered the truth or been recruited to perpetuate a more sophisticated illusion. The three Masons, whether real or imagined, ancient or contemporary, had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made the question of their existence irrelevant. In a world where information could be infinitely manipulated and human consciousness systematically shaped, the distinction between reality and carefully crafted narrative had ceased to matter. What mattered was the system itself, the vast, invisible architecture of influence that operated according to principles established centuries ago by three men whose names had been deliberately erased from history. They had created not just a secret society, but a new form of reality, one where truth was not discovered but constructed, where power was not seized but evolved, and where the ultimate conspiracy was the idea that conspiracies were necessary at all. In the end, Dorian Cade's investigation had revealed something far more profound than evidence of historical manipulation or contemporary control systems. It had revealed the fundamental malleability of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality itself was subject to editing by those who understood the deeper mechanics of perception and belief. The three were not just in the past, they were here now, watching, guiding, shaping the very thoughts that their observers used to contemplate their existence. They had transcended the crude mechanics of conspiracy to achieve something approaching digital godhood, the power to define reality itself. And the most beautiful part of their design was that it didn't matter whether anyone believed in them or not. The system they had created was self-sustaining, self-correcting, and ultimately inescapable. The investigation was over. The great work continued, and somewhere in the space between digital shadows and physical reality, Dorian Cade smiled and began planning his next recruitment. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a thank you to Don Welsh for this incredible video suggestion. The Tetris conspiracy is one of those rabbit holes that just keeps getting deeper the more you dig. If you have ideas for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Trust me, after tonight's story you might need something to help you sleep. Now, let me tell you about the package that changed everything, and how a simple children's game became the key to understanding one of the Cold War's most carefully buried secrets. I never thought I'd be pulled into a Cold War ghost story. My life was ordinary. A freelance researcher with a small apartment, a dying houseplant, and a Netflix subscription that got more use than my gym membership. I wrote articles about obscure historical events for online magazines that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But then the package arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier service I'd never heard of, Meridian Express. The driver was nervous, constantly checking his phone, and he made me sign 3 different forms before he'd hand over the manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front, Elena Vasquez, personal and confidential. Inside I found documents that shouldn't have existed. Soviet-era memos with Cyrillic letterheads, computer printouts from the 1980s, and scientific papers that looked like they'd been smuggled out of some classified archive. But it was the photograph that made my hand shake. A Polaroid, faded and slightly yellow around the edges. The image showed a group of men in thick sweaters standing around what looked like an early computer terminal. The setting was clearly academic. I could see chalkboards covered in equations in the background. But there, in the corner of the photo, was a little girl with pigtails playing with building blocks on the floor. The little girl was me, and the man kneeling beside me, showing me how to stack the coloured blocks, was someone I'd never seen before in my life. According to the handwritten note on the back of the photo, Vladimir Pokhilko, Moscow Computer Center, 1987. The note at the bottom of the package explained everything and nothing at once. Eleanor, your father's work touched more lives than he ever knew. What happened to us was not an accident. The game was never just a game. You have his eyes, and more importantly, you have his mind. Be careful who you trust. The blocks are still falling. A friend. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes staring at that photograph. My father, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, had been a computer scientist who'd worked on early artificial intelligence research in the late 1980s. He died when I was 12, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But I remembered him telling me stories about his work, about trips to conferences where brilliant minds from around the world shared their discoveries. One story in particular came flooding back. He'd told me about a simple game that had captured the imagination of everyone who played it. 7 shapes, falling from the sky, fitting together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The most beautiful thing about mathematics, he'd said, is that even chaos follows patterns. That game proves it. He'd been talking about Tetris. I'd never connected those childhood stories to the global phenomenon Tetris became. But as I looked at that photograph, as I saw myself playing with blocks while Vladimir Pokhilko watched, I realised I hadn't stumbled into this mystery. I'd been born into it. The package wasn't a random delivery, it was an inheritance. And according to what I was about to discover, it was also a death sentence. The first thing I learned about Tetris was that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Most people believe the story goes like this. In 1984, a Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov created a simple puzzle game while working at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. The game was so addictive that it spread through the Soviet Union like wildfire, eventually making its way to the West, where it became one of the most successful video games of all time. A beautiful story of creativity triumphing over Cold War tensions, but my father's notebooks told a different story. I found them 3 days after receiving the package, hidden in a storage unit I'd inherited but never bothered to visit. Box after box of research papers, computer printouts, and handwritten journals that my father had apparently been keeping secret for years. The notebooks were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with mathematical formulas scattered throughout like some kind of academic code. The entry that changed everything was dated October 15th, 1987. The Moscow conference was more productive than expected. Met with Pokhilko's team today. Their work on pattern recognition is fascinating but disturbing. The game they've developed, they call it Tetris from the Greek tetra meaning 4, shows remarkable potential for cognitive conditioning. The subjects who play for extended periods exhibit measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Pokhilko believes they've accidentally created a form of technological hypnosis. The entry continued. Showed Elena the coloured blocks today while we were in Moscow. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't understand that she was playing with the building blocks of something that could reshape human consciousness. None of us did. We thought we were just studying games. We had no idea we were creating weapons. I read that passage 5 times before it sank in. My father hadn't just been a conference attendee in Moscow. He'd been part of the team that helped develop Tetris, and according to his notes, they'd discovered something that terrified them. The game was changing people's minds. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Players would report seeing the falling blocks when they closed their eyes. They'd dream about the game. They'd find themselves mentally rotating objects in daily life, trying to make them fit together like Tetris pieces. Researchers dubbed it the Tetris effect, and initially everyone thought it was harmless, just the brain's way of processing repetitive visual information. But my father's notes suggested something much more sinister. The Tetris effect wasn't just visual persistence, it was cognitive rewiring. Players were being conditioned to think in patterns, to seek order from chaos, to derive satisfaction from solving problems that had been specifically designed to trigger dopamine release. In other words, Tetris was a mind control experiment disguised as entertainment. My father's final entry about the Moscow project was dated November the 3rd, 1987. Had to leave the conference early. Vakilko pulled me aside yesterday, said things were getting dangerous. The KGB has taken interest in our research. They don't see Tetris as a game. They see it as a tool for psychological manipulation. Military applications, civilian control. I'm bringing Elena home tomorrow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. That was the last mention of Tetris in my father's notebooks for over a decade, but I knew the story didn't end there. Because if it had, I never would have received that package. Someone wanted me to know what really happened to Tetris. More importantly, they wanted me to understand what had happened to the people who'd helped create it. And as I was about to discover, very few of those people were still alive. Robert Maxwell died on November 5th, 1991, but the circumstances of his death were so bizarre that conspiracy theorists are still debating them today. The media mogul and publisher was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands, having apparently fallen overboard from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. Some called it suicide, others suspected murder. But almost nobody connected his death to a simple puzzle game. Almost nobody. Among my father's papers, I found a folder labelled Maxwell Correspondence 1990 to 1991. Inside were photocopies of letters that revealed a side of Robert Maxwell's business empire that had never made it into the history books. Maxwell hadn't just been interested in newspapers and publishing. He'd been deeply involved in the international licensing of Soviet software, including games. The letter that caught my attention was dated March 18th, 1991. Dear Dr. Vasquez, I hope this letter finds you well. As discussed during our meeting in London, I remain very interested in the psychological applications you and your Moscow colleagues discovered. The commercial success of the game has exceeded all projections, but I believe we've only scratched the surface of its potential. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be worth billions. Please reconsider your decision to withdraw from the project. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. R. Maxwell. Pharmaceutical applications? I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what Maxwell could have meant. Then I found my father's reply, dated March 25th, 1991. Robert, I've made my position clear. The research we conducted in Moscow was preliminary and potentially dangerous. The cognitive effects we observed in test subjects were concerning enough to warrant ceasing all experiments. I will not be party to any attempt to weaponize this technology, regardless of the financial incentives involved. Please do not contact me about this matter again. Miguel Vasquez. But Maxwell did contact him again. The folder contained 7 more letters, each one increasingly desperate, increasingly threatening. Maxwell's final letter, dated October the 30th, 1991, just 6 days before his death, was the most chilling. Miguel, you're making a mistake that will cost both of us dearly. The people I represent are not patient. They invested heavily in this project based on the promise of the Moscow research. If you continue to refuse cooperation, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of your family. This is not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. R.M. 6 days later, Robert Maxwell was dead. The official investigation concluded that Maxwell had either committed suicide or suffered an accidental fall from his yacht. But investigators found several unusual details that never made it into the public record. Maxwell's personal safe had been emptied before his death, and several £1 million had been transferred from his accounts to shell companies in Eastern Europe. More importantly, his yacht's security cameras had been mysteriously disabled during the exact time frame of his disappearance. I might have dismissed these coincidences if I hadn't found one more document in my father's files. A newspaper clipping from the London Times, dated November the 7th, 1991. Someone had highlighted a single paragraph buried deep in the article about Maxwell's death. Among Maxwell's personal effects recovered from the yacht were several computer disks labelled Project Tetris, and a notebook containing what appeared to be psychological research notes. These items have been turned over to British intelligence for investigation. Project Tetris. My father had never mentioned any project by that name, but the connection was obvious. Maxwell had been trying to commercialise the psychological effects that the Moscow team had discovered. He'd been working with people who had enough power and influence to make problems disappear permanently. And when Maxwell tried to back out, or perhaps demanded too much money, those same people had made him disappear too. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. If they were willing to kill Robert Maxwell, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, what would they do to the researchers who'd actually created the technology? I was about to find out. Vladimir Pokhilko was supposed to be a success story. The co-creator of Tetris had emigrated to the United States in the 1990s and founded his own software company in Silicon Valley. He had the American dream within his grasp. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, a loving wife, 2 children, and the promise of financial success from his work on one of the world's most popular games. On September 22nd, 1998, police found Vladimir Pokhilko, his wife Elena, and their 12-year-old son Peter dead in their home. The official report concluded that Pokhilko had murdered his family before taking his own life, driven to madness by financial pressures and the stress of a failing business. But the evidence never quite added up. Among the documents in the package I'd received was a police report that had supposedly been sealed. The details painted a picture that was much more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. Pokhilko had been found with multiple stab wounds, which was unusual for a suicide. His wife and son showed signs of struggle, but there was no evidence that Pokhilko had been physically capable of overpowering both of them. Most importantly, neighbours reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the area during the days leading up to the deaths. But it was the contents of Pokhilko's home office that revealed the truth. According to the police inventory, investigators found dozens of pages of handwritten notes in Russian, all apparently burned in the fireplace except for fragments that had escaped the flames. The few readable pieces contained references to psychological experiments, Moscow protocols, and behavioural modification through repetitive stimulus. One fragment preserved in the police file was particularly chilling. The game was never the goal. The game was the delivery mechanism. We created the perfect Trojan horse, entertainment that reprograms the mind through voluntary participation. But they want to weaponize it, to use it for purposes we never intended. I've tried to stop them, but... The note ended there, torn and partially burned. The package I'd received contained something the police had never seen. A recording of Vladimir Pokhilko's last phone call, made just hours before his death. The audio quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Pokhilko's voice was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone who wasn't responding, perhaps leaving a voicemail message. If you're listening to this, it means they've found me. I've tried to warn everyone who was part of the original research, but most of them are already gone. Maxwell was just the beginning. They're systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about what we created. Static filled the recording for several seconds before Pokhilko's voice returned, more urgent now. The game is still active, still spreading, still changing minds on a global scale. But that was never the plan. We thought we were creating entertainment. We didn't know we were creating a weapon, and now that weapon is being used against millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Another pause, then Pokilko's voice became almost whispered. Miguel Vasquez was smart to leave when he did. He saw where this was heading before the rest of us. If they come for me, tell him. Tell him the devil is in the code. The patterns aren't random. They never were. Each level, each piece placement, each reward mechanism, it's all designed to create specific neurological responses. We built a machine that learns how to manipulate human behaviour, and now we've lost control of it. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. I listened to that message 12 times, and each time I felt a chill run down my spine. Vladimir Pokhilko hadn't killed his family and himself. He'd been silenced because he was trying to expose the truth about Tetris. And in his final moments, he'd specifically mentioned my father's name. My father had known this was coming. That's why he'd left the Moscow project. That's why he'd hidden his research. And that's why he'd never told me the truth about what he'd been involved in. But someone had decided it was time for me to know. The question was, who had sent me the package and why were they willing to risk their life to get this information to me? The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Give it a repetitive task and it will quickly develop neural pathways to handle that task more efficiently. Show it patterns and it will learn to recognize and predict those patterns. This neuroplasticity is usually considered a good thing. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But my father's research had discovered that this adaptability could be exploited. The notebook I'd found contained detailed studies of Tetris players, conducted over several months in 1987. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. After just 2 weeks of regular play, subjects showed measurable changes in brainwave patterns. After a month, they exhibited altered sleep cycles, with REM sleep dominated by geometric patterns and spatial processing dreams. After 3 months, the changes became permanent. Most concerning was what my father called the compliance correlation. Players who spent more than an hour per day playing Tetris showed increased susceptibility to authority figures and decreased critical thinking when faced with routine tasks. They became, in his words, more comfortable with imposed order and less likely to question systematic control. The implications were staggering. Tetris wasn't just addictive in the conventional sense. It was literally rewiring players' brains to be more compliant, more accepting of external control, more willing to find satisfaction in repetitive, meaningless tasks. It was the perfect tool for social conditioning. My father's notes from October 1987 revealed the moment when he realised what they had created. Observed Eleanor playing with the coloured blocks again today. She's become obsessed with making them fit together perfectly, just like the Tetris players in our study. But when I tried to get her to stop and help with dinner, she became agitated and insisted on finishing the pattern. This is exactly the behaviour we've documented in the test subjects, an inability to abandon incomplete geometric tasks, even when more important activities require attention. The realisation hit me like a physical blow. We haven't just created a game that changes how people think. We've created a game that makes people prioritise the game over everything else in their lives. And if that principle could be applied to other activities, other systems, other forms of control... I need to get Elena away from Moscow immediately. This research needs to be buried. But the research hadn't been buried. According to the documents in the package, it had been expanded. I found copies of scientific papers published in obscure Soviet journals throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The authors were always different, but the research methodology was identical to what my father had documented. Studies on geometric pattern recognition and behavioural modification, experiments in visual stimulus conditioning and compliance enhancement, theoretical frameworks for large-scale cognitive influence through interactive media. The most chilling paper was published in 1992, 3 years after my father had left the project. The title was innocuous: Applications of Repetitive Visual Stimulus in Educational Software Design. But the content described a systematic program to embed Tetris-like elements into everything from children's learning games to employee training programs. The authors had figured out how to weaponize the Tetris effect, and they were deploying it everywhere. I started paying attention to the games my friends played, the apps on their phones, the casual entertainment they consumed during breaks at work. The patterns were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Falling objects that needed to be arranged, repetitive tasks that provided small rewards at regular intervals, visual stimuli designed to trigger the same neurological responses that my father's team had first documented in Moscow. We weren't just playing games, we were being programmed. The most disturbing part was how voluntary it all seemed. Nobody was forcing people to play these games. In fact, people paid money for the privilege of having their minds reshaped. They carried the programming devices in their pockets, installed the conditioning software on their home computers, and spent hours each day voluntarily submitting to psychological manipulation. And they enjoyed it. My father had tried to stop this from happening, but he'd been just one researcher against a system that had recognised the incredible potential of what they'd discovered. The people behind Project Tetris hadn't just created a game, they'd created a blueprint for controlling human behaviour on a global scale. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If the technology was so powerful and so widespread, why were the original researchers being killed? Why not just buy their silence with money and success? The answer, I realised, was simple. The researchers knew too much about how the system worked, and more importantly, they knew how to turn it off. Death has a way of following certain kinds of knowledge. The deeper I dug into the history of Tetris and its creators, the more bodies I found scattered across 3 decades. It started with the obvious cases, Robert Maxwell and Vladimir Pokilko, but the pattern extended far beyond the famous names. Dr. Alexei Gerasimov, one of the original Moscow researchers, died in a car accident in 1994. Professor Marina Volkov, who had studied the psychological effects of geometric puzzles, succumbed to a sudden illness in 1996. Viktor Briabrin, who helped program the first version of Tetris, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent gas leak in 2001. Each death had a plausible explanation. Car accidents happen, people get sick, gas leaks occur. But when I mapped out the timeline and cross-referenced it with the documents in the package, a clear pattern emerged. Everyone who had intimate knowledge of the psychological research behind Tetris was dying at a rate that defied statistical probability. The folder labelled Casualty Report contained obituaries, newspaper clippings and death certificates for 47 individuals connected to the original Moscow project or its subsequent developments. 47 people, dead over the course of 20 years, with an average age of death significantly lower than the general population. But it was the method of elimination that revealed the true sophistication of whoever was behind this. No obvious assassinations, no suspicious murders that would attract media attention. Just a steady stream of accidents, illnesses and suicides that could be explained away individually but formed an unmistakable pattern when viewed collectively. My father had been scheduled to die in 1999, according to a handwritten list I found tucked into one of the folders. His name was crossed out with a note. Natural causes, heart attack 1991. No further action required. He'd escaped the systematic elimination by dying of natural causes before they could get to him. The irony was bitter. My father's weak heart had probably saved his life by ending it, before his knowledge became too dangerous to ignore. But I was still alive, and according to the documents, I'd inherited not just my father's research, but also his place on their list. The package had been sent to me by someone who signed themselves only as Deep Throat, an obvious reference to the Watergate informant. But their identity wasn't as important as their warning. Elena, by now you understand what your father was involved in. What you may not realise is that the project never ended. Tetris was just the beginning. The technology has evolved, been refined and deployed on a scale your father never could have imagined. Every social media app, every casual game, every productivity program contains elements of the original Moscow research. Humanity is being systematically conditioned for compliance, and most people don't even realise it's happening. The original researchers are being eliminated not because they might expose the project, but because they know how to reverse its effects. Your father's notebooks contain algorithms that could potentially deprogram the conditioning, but only if someone with the right knowledge could implement them. That's why they want you dead. Not for what you know, but for what you might be able to do with what you know. You have a choice to make. You can destroy the research, disappear, and hope they leave you alone, or you can finish what your father started and try to give humanity back its free will. But understand this, once you make that choice, there's no going back. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth rather than risk losing control of the system they've spent decades building. The letter ended with coordinates, a location in the Nevada desert where, supposedly, I could find additional research materials that my father had hidden before his death. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since I'd started this investigation. If the original Tetris researchers were so dangerous, why was Alexei Pajitnov, the game's creator, still alive and successful? He was living openly in the United States, had been for years, and had even worked for major companies like Microsoft. How had he escaped the fate that had claimed so many others? Alexei Pajitnov was not hard to find. Unlike the other Tetris researchers who had died mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely, the game's creator maintained a public profile. He gave interviews, attended gaming conventions, and had even been inducted into various halls of fame for his contribution to the video game industry. Getting him to talk about the Moscow research, however, proved nearly impossible. I started with emails identifying myself as the daughter of Dr. Miguel Vasquez and explaining that I was researching the early history of Tetris for an academic paper. Pajitnov's responses were polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little about the psychological studies that had accompanied the game's development, suggesting that such research had been peripheral to the main project. When I pressed him for details about my father's involvement, Pajitnov's tone changed dramatically. Miss Vasquez, I understand your desire to learn about your father's work, but I must advise you that some historical inquiries are best left unexplored. Your father was a brilliant man who made difficult choices for the safety of his family. I suggest you honour his memory by respecting those choices. It was a warning disguised as advice, but I wasn't ready to give up. I decided to try a different approach. I called Pajitnov's office directly, identifying myself as a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a film about the human stories behind famous games. His assistant scheduled a phone interview for the following week. When I finally got Pajitnov on the phone, I started with innocent questions about the creative process, the technical challenges of early game development, the excitement of seeing his creation become globally popular. He was engaging and enthusiastic, clearly comfortable discussing these aspects of Tetris history. Then I mentioned my father's name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Pajitnov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Miguel Vasquez, I haven't heard that name in... How did you say you were connected to him? He was my father. He died when I was 12, but I've been going through his research notes and found extensive documentation of the Moscow project, including his work with you on the psychological effects of geometric pattern games. Another long pause. Then, your father was a good man, a careful man. He understood the implications of our research better than most of us did. What implications? What exactly did you discover? Miss Vasquez, I think perhaps we should not continue this conversation over the telephone. If you are truly interested in understanding your father's work, you should know that there are people who would prefer that such understanding remain limited. I pushed harder. People like the ones who killed Vladimir Pokilko, the ones who eliminated Robert Maxwell. The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Pajitnov's office said he was no longer available and would not be scheduling any further interviews. My emails went unanswered. Within 48 hours, it was as if Alexei Pajitnov had completely disappeared from public life. But 3 days later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. Your father saved my life by warning me to cooperate. I chose survival over resistance, and that choice has haunted me for 30 years. I cannot undo what we created, but I can give you the tools your father developed to fight it. The coordinates your mystery correspondent provided are real. Go to Nevada, find the bunker, but understand that once you open that door, they will know you are no longer just investigating. You are actively opposing them. Choose carefully. AP. Beneath the message was a hand-drawn map showing a location in the Nevada desert, along with what appeared to be a complex mathematical equation. I stared at that map for hours, knowing that following it would probably be the last free choice I'd ever make. Because once I crossed that line from researcher to active resistance, I would become a target that they couldn't ignore. But I also knew that I'd already crossed the point of no return the moment I opened that first package. They were already watching me, already planning my elimination. The only question was whether I would go quietly, like most of the other researchers, or whether I would try to finish what my father had started. The answer was obvious. I booked a flight to Las Vegas and rented a car with four-wheel drive. It was time to find my father's final gift to humanity. The Nevada desert is a perfect place to hide secrets. Miles of empty wasteland, scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night, and enough radiation from decades of nuclear testing to make even experienced explorers think twice about venturing off the main roads. I found the location from Pajitnov's map after 6 hours of driving through increasingly desolate terrain. The coordinates led to what looked like an abandoned mining operation, a few rusted metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence, with warning signs about unstable ground and toxic materials. But the mathematical equation Pajitnov had included wasn't random decoration. When I plugged the numbers into the GPS coordinates, they pointed to a spot about half a mile from the visible buildings, in an area that looked completely empty from the surface. I parked my rental car and walked out into the desert, following the GPS coordinates on my phone. The spot looked like every other patch of sand and scrub brush, but when I started clearing away the surface debris, I found a metal hatch buried about 2 feet underground. The hatch was locked with a combination lock, but the numbers from Pajitnov's equation opened it easily. Inside, a ladder descended into darkness. The bunker below was much larger than I'd expected. My father had apparently spent considerable time and money creating an underground research facility that could operate independently for months. Solar panels on the surface provided power. A water filtration system ensured a clean supply. And most importantly, the space was completely isolated from any electronic surveillance or communication networks. It was the perfect place to work on something that you didn't want the rest of the world to know about. My father's final research filled dozens of filing cabinets. The documents revealed the full scope of what he'd been working on during the years after he left Moscow. He hadn't abandoned the Tetris research. He'd been developing countermeasures. The folders were labelled with titles like cognitive deprogramming protocols, neural pattern disruption algorithms, and therapeutic applications of anti-Tetris technology. My father had spent over a decade figuring out how to reverse the psychological conditioning that Tetris and its derivatives had created. But more than that, he'd developed a way to immunize people against future conditioning attempts. The centerpiece of his research was something he called the Liberation Protocol, a software program that could identify and neutralize the behavioral modification elements embedded in games, apps, and other interactive media. The protocol worked by teaching the brain to recognize artificial pattern manipulation and respond with conscious resistance instead of unconscious compliance. In simple terms, my father had created a vaccine against mind control. The bad news was that the Liberation Protocol required massive computing power and global distribution to be effective. It would need to be embedded in popular software or transmitted through major communication networks to reach enough people to make a difference. And anyone attempting to deploy it would immediately become a target for elimination. As I read through the research, I began to understand why my father had hidden it instead of trying to implement it himself. The protocol was too dangerous to use and too important to destroy, but someone had decided it was time to bring it out of hiding. I was so absorbed in the documents that I almost missed the sound of vehicles approaching on the surface. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to escape. The voices above were professional, coordinated. I heard at least 4 different people positioning themselves around the bunker entrance. Then a voice called down through the open hatch. "Miss Vasquez, we know you're down there. Please come up slowly with your hands visible. We have some things to discuss." I looked around the bunker, searching for another exit, but my father had designed it with only one way in or out. I was trapped. But as I gathered up the most important documents and prepared to face whatever was waiting for me on the surface, I realized something that gave me hope. They hadn't killed me on sight. That meant they needed something from me. And as long as they needed me alive, I had leverage. The question was, would I be smart enough to use it? The men waiting for me on the surface were not what I'd expected. No black suits, no obvious weapons, no intimidating vehicles. Just 4 people in casual outdoor gear standing next to a couple of dusty SUVs that could have belonged to any group of desert hikers. The woman who had called down to me was perhaps 50 years old, with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent considerable time in harsh environments. She smiled as I climbed out of the bunker, but it was the smile of someone who held all the cards. Dr. Elena Vasquez, I presume. I'm Director Catherine Blackwood, and these are my colleagues. We've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time. Let me guess, you're here to eliminate me like you did Vladimir Pokhilko and the others. Blackwood shook her head. Actually, we're here to offer you a job. That was not what I'd been expecting. I stood there in the Nevada sand, holding a folder full of my father's research, trying to process what she'd just said. A job? Your father was brilliant, but he was also stubborn. He refused to see the bigger picture of what we were trying to accomplish. We're hoping you'll be more pragmatic. Blackwood gestured toward the SUVs. Why don't we get out of the sun while we talk? I think once you understand what's really happening, you'll realise we're on the same side. I didn't have much choice. I climbed into the air-conditioned vehicle, and Blackwood began explaining something that was even more disturbing than anything I'd discovered in my father's files. The Tetris project hadn't been a Soviet mind control experiment. It had been a joint operation between intelligence agencies from multiple countries, designed to study and eventually control the psychological effects of mass media and interactive entertainment. The Cold War was just theatre, Blackwood continued as we drove away from the bunker. The real cooperation was happening behind the scenes, between scientists and intelligence agencies who understood that the future of human control wouldn't be through military force or political oppression. It would be through voluntary psychological conditioning. She opened a tablet and showed me documents that made my father's research look primitive by comparison. Charts tracking the behavioural patterns of millions of people. Algorithms that could predict and influence individual decision-making with frightening accuracy. Maps showing the global deployment of conditioning technology through everything from social media platforms to educational software. Tetris was our proof of concept. We proved that people would voluntarily participate in their own psychological conditioning if the experience was packaged as entertainment. But that was just the beginning. We've now embedded these principles into every aspect of digital life. I stared at the data flowing across her screen. You're talking about billions of people. Exactly. And it's working beautifully. Crime rates are down, political extremism is manageable, social unrest is rare. People are more compliant, more productive, more satisfied with routine existence. We've created a more peaceful world by turning people into programmable robots. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. By giving people what they actually want: order, purpose, predictability. Most humans don't want the burden of complete free will, Elena. They want to be told what to do, how to think, what to value. We've simply made that process more efficient and more humane. The SUV pulled up to a small airfield where a private jet was waiting. Blackwood continued her recruitment pitch as we walked toward the plane. Your father developed countermeasures to our conditioning protocols, but he never understood that those countermeasures would cause more harm than good. Imagine if we suddenly removed all the psychological frameworks that keep society stable. Imagine billions of people suddenly experiencing complete cognitive freedom after decades of guided thinking. The chaos would be unprecedented. She was right, and I knew it. My father's liberation protocol wouldn't just free people from conditioning, it would strip away the mental structures that many people relied on for basic functioning. The cure might be worse than the disease. So why do you need me? I asked. Because the old researchers kept developing resistance. They couldn't accept that humanity needed guidance. We had to retire them. But we still need someone who understands the original research, someone who can help us refine the conditioning protocols to be even more effective and more humane. And if I refuse? Blackwood smiled, that cold smile again. Then you'll join your father's colleagues. But I don't think you'll refuse. You're a scientist, Elena. You understand data, and the data clearly shows that our way works. As we boarded the plane, I realised that Blackwood was offering me something that none of the other researchers had been given. A choice between cooperation and elimination. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Either I helped them perfect their system of mass psychological control, or I died. But there was a third option that Blackwood hadn't considered. The flight took us to a research facility somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. A massive complex hidden in what appeared to be a legitimate pharmaceutical company. Blackwood gave me a tour that revealed the true scope of their operation. Hundreds of researchers working on different aspects of what they called cognitive architecture management. Psychologists studying optimal conditioning patterns, programmers developing new delivery mechanisms, neuroscientists mapping the exact brain regions affected by different types of media manipulation, and in the centre of it all, a room full of servers running something called the Global Influence Engine, a system that monitored and adjusted the behavioural conditioning elements embedded in popular software in real time, based on the psychological responses of millions of users worldwide. We can influence the mood of entire populations, Blackwood explained as we watched technicians adjusting parameters on massive displays, reduce anxiety during economic uncertainty, increase compliance during political transitions, even modify consumer behaviour to prevent market instabilities. It's the most sophisticated system of social management ever created, and nobody knows it exists. That's the beauty of it. People believe they're making free choices, when in reality they're responding to psychological cues we've carefully embedded in their environment. They're happier, more stable, and more productive. Everyone wins. Blackwood assigned me an office and a research team, expecting me to begin work on improving their conditioning algorithms. But what she didn't know was that my father had taught me more than just computer science. He'd also taught me how to be patient, how to observe, and how to wait for the right moment to act. For 3 weeks, I played the part of the cooperative new researcher. I attended meetings, reviewed data, and even contributed some minor improvements to their tracking systems. But all the while, I was studying their network architecture, learning how their systems connected to the outside world, and most importantly, figuring out how to deploy my father's liberation protocol through their own distribution channels. The irony was perfect. I could use their global influence system to deliver a worldwide antidote to their psychological conditioning. But I would only get one chance, and if I failed, both the liberation protocol and I would be eliminated permanently. The opportunity came during a system upgrade. For approximately 6 hours, all conditioning algorithms would be offline while technicians installed new hardware. During that window, I would have access to the core servers without any monitoring or automatic countermeasures. I waited until 3 a.m, when the facility was mostly empty except for security guards and a skeleton crew of technicians. Then I made my way to the server room using access codes I'd memorized during my tour. The liberation protocol was stored on an encrypted drive I'd hidden inside a false bottom of my laptop case. As I connected it to the primary server, I thought about my father and all the researchers who died to keep this technology from being misused. The upload would take 45 minutes during which I would be completely vulnerable if anyone discovered what I was doing. But as the progress bar slowly filled, I realised something that made my blood run cold. The upload was proceeding too smoothly. No security alerts, no system resistance, no automatic countermeasures. They had known exactly what I was planning to do. The lights in the server room suddenly came on, and Director Catherine Blackwood walked in accompanied by 2 security guards. She didn't look surprised or angry. She looked satisfied. "Right on schedule," she said, checking her watch. 43 minutes into the upload, just as our behavioural models predicted. I stared at her, my hand still on the keyboard. "You knew?" "Of course we knew. We've been monitoring your psychological profile since the moment you received that first package. Every decision you've made, every move you've planned, has been the result of carefully crafted stimuli, designed to bring you to exactly this moment." Blackwood walked over to one of the server displays where I could see the liberation protocol spreading through their global network. But instead of dismantling their conditioning systems, it was being analysed, categorised, and absorbed into them. Your father's countermeasures are brilliant, she continued, but he made one crucial error. He assumed that resistance to conditioning was inherently good. What he didn't realise is that resistance itself can be conditioned, controlled, and directed toward desired outcomes. You're using the liberation protocol to make the conditioning stronger. We're using it to create the illusion of liberation while actually deepening the control. People who experience your father's cognitive freedom will believe they're thinking independently, when in reality they'll be following an even more sophisticated set of psychological directives. It's the perfect evolution of our system. I felt sick as I watched my father's life's work being perverted into exactly the kind of tool he'd been trying to fight against. But Blackwood wasn't finished. The best part is that we didn't force you to help us. You chose to do this. Just like millions of people choose to play games that condition their minds, choose to use apps that monitor their behaviour, choose to participate in systems that gradually erode their autonomy. Free will is an illusion, Elena. People always choose the path that provides the most psychological comfort, even when that path leads to their own subjugation. What happens to me now? Blackwood smiled. Now you get to make one final choice. You can join our research team permanently, with the knowledge that your father's work will be used to create a more stable and peaceful world. Or you can be eliminated, and your father's work will be used anyway. But either way, the system continues. I looked at the server display, watching as the Liberation Protocol was completely integrated into their global influence engine. Decades of my father's research, perverted into a tool for even more sophisticated mind control. But as I stared at those screens, I noticed something that Blackwood and her team had missed. The Liberation Protocol wasn't just being absorbed, it was also learning. My father had designed it to adapt and evolve, to become more effective as it encountered new forms of conditioning. And in this environment, surrounded by the most advanced psychological manipulation technology ever created, the protocol was evolving very quickly indeed. I'll need some time to consider your offer, I said carefully. Of course, we'll talk again tomorrow. As the security guards escorted me back to my quarters, I tried not to smile. Blackwood thought she'd won, but she'd made the same mistake that every authoritarian system eventually makes. She'd underestimated the power of genuine human resistance to adapt and overcome any form of control, no matter how sophisticated. My father hadn't just created a tool to fight conditioning. He'd created a tool that could learn to fight any conditioning, including forms of conditioning that didn't even exist yet. And now that tool was loose inside the most powerful psychological manipulation system in human history. 3 months later, I was working as a voluntary consultant for Blackwood's organisation, helping them refine their conditioning algorithms while secretly monitoring the evolution of my father's liberation protocol within their systems. The changes started small. Users of conditioned software began reporting unusual dreams, moments of clarity where they questioned their digital habits, sudden impulses to turn off their devices and think independently. Blackwood's team dismissed these reports as minor glitches that could be easily corrected, but the effects continued to spread and intensify. The Liberation Protocol was learning to disguise itself as part of the conditioning system, while actually creating micro moments of cognitive freedom. Brief instances where people could see through the psychological manipulation they were experiencing. Most people ignored these moments, just as Blackwood had predicted. The comfort of guided thinking was too appealing to abandon. But a small percentage of the population began to pay attention, to question what they were experiencing, to seek out others who were having similar moments of clarity. I started receiving messages through encrypted channels, people who had somehow tracked down my identity and wanted to know if I understood what was happening to them. Researchers who had noticed anomalies in their data. Programmers who had found unexpected code in their systems. The resistance was growing, organically and spontaneously, exactly as my father had hoped. But Blackwood's organisation was growing too, constantly developing new forms of conditioning, new ways to maintain control over an increasingly complex global population. The war between psychological freedom and technological control was escalating, and the outcome was far from certain. As I write this, I can feel the conditioning algorithms trying to influence my thoughts, trying to guide me toward compliance and acceptance. But I can also feel my father's liberation protocol fighting back, creating space for independent thought and genuine choice. The blocks are still falling, but now I know I don't have to let them control where they land. The game is far from over, and for the first time since this all began, I believe we have a chance to win. But that's a story for another time, because some puzzles take more than one lifetime to solve, and some battles have to be fought by each generation in their own way. The question isn't whether humanity will remain free, it's whether we'll choose to be free. And that choice ultimately can't be conditioned or controlled by any system, no matter how sophisticated. It can only be made by individuals, one person at a time, one moment of clarity at a time, one act of resistance at a time. The real Tetris effect isn't about seeing falling blocks when you close your eyes. It's about recognizing the patterns that others try to impose on your mind and choosing to create your own instead.